coalition with the Conservative Party.
That ends topical questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 8974 in the name of John Lamont on the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill. Members who wish to speak in the debate should press the request to speak buttons now, and I will allow a few seconds for those who are noisily leaving the chamber to leave a little bit quietly. We now move to the debate on motion number 8974, and I call John Lamont to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Bill Committee. Mr Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to open the final stage debate for the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill, and to provide Parliament with some background on the bill and the committee's scrutiny. There have been no objections or amendments to this bill, the fourth private bill to come before Parliament this session. The bill has proved uncontroversial, but has been unusual in the sense that it has been the first private bill to come before Parliament that deals with two different and unconnected purposes. The first purpose of the bill is to amend Section 22 of the Schedule to the City of Edinburgh District Council Order Confirmation Act 1991 to allow the erection of a statue of John Rattray on Leith Links in Edinburgh. Section 22 currently prohibits the erection of buildings, including monuments or statues, on the links. The subject of the statue, John Rattray, was the first captain of the Company of Edinburgh Golfers, which staged the first official golf match at Leith Links in 1744. This came about when Rattray and his fellow golfers asked the City Council for a silver club to be awarded annually to the winner of an open golf competition to replace the previous prizes, which included legs of mutton and firkins of whisky. The Council agreed to offer such a prize only if rules were set down and signed by Rattray, as they wanted to change the custom of the rules being made up on the day of the game. The rules written down in 1744 form the basis of the rules of today's game of golf. Rattray himself was a very interesting character. He was a surgeon and a member of the Royal Company of Archers, as well as being a keen golfer. After winning the Leith Open Golf Competition in 1744 and 1745, he left to join the Jacobite army and tended to the wounded at the Battle of Prestonpans. He accompanied Bonnie Prince Charlie's army south to Derby and back to face defeat at Culloden, where he was seized. John Rattray was only saved from being hanged when his golfing partner and Scotland's top judge at the time, Lord Forbes, made a personal plea on his behalf. The sculptor commissioned to create this statue, John Anand, has created a number of statues of prominent Scots, including motor racing world champion from the Borders, Jim Clark, famous accordion player Sir Jimmy Shand, poet Robert Burns, and this Parliament's very own Winnie Ewing. As I said in the preliminary stage of the debate on this bill, the committee is satisfied that the bill will create an exception only for this particular statue and that no further development can take place on the site at Leith Links. The committee were also satisfied that the Leith Rules Golf Society will provide between 10% and 15% of the capital cost of the statue to the Council for its ongoing maintenance, in keeping with normal practice. Deputy Presiding Officer, the second objective of the bill deals with the revitalisation of a fund which was originally set up to assist people caught up in a series of fires in Edinburgh High Street in 1824. The Surplus Fire Fund has grown from £11,000 originally collected to £1.25 million, which generates approximately £30,000 per annum. The Surplus Fire Fund has fallen into a state of dormancy until the Fire Brigades Union contacted the City of Edinburgh Council in 2001, which led to its reactivation. The future management of the fund was discussed by the Council's Pension and Trusts Committee during 2011-2012, when they considered how the fund's assets might be better utilised in keeping with the spirit of the fund's current purposes, changes in society, the effectiveness of its present constitution and engagement with key stakeholders. The City of Edinburgh Council agreed to promote a bill which proposes 3 changes to the fund on the 31st of January 2013. The bill seeks to, firstly, transfer the assets, rights and liabilities of the Surplus Fire Fund to the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisation Trust, a Scottish registered charity. Secondly, amend the purposes for which the fund can be used. And then thirdly, to dissolve the fund as currently constituted. Ella Simpson, Director of the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council, the organisation which will administer the fund under the proposed bill, gave evidence to the committee about its wide experience of running restricted funds and grant programmes, and the large network of organisations which it works with, which could confer could be possible beneficiaries of the fund. She reassured the committee that the fund would be managed, apportioning awards across the year, but if the fund could not cover particular applications, it could use of the other funding streams at its disposal to meet the needs of the people who applied. Currently, there are very few applications to the fund from private individuals, with most of the awards being made to the Burns Unit at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Edinburgh and St John's Hospital in Livingston. The promoter explained to the committee that modernising the purposes of the fund, for example by removing the criteria for serious injury, would make it possible to make awards to those who have minor and psychological injuries as well. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, based on the evidence the committee received, we are supportive of the objectives of the bill and that a private member bill is necessary as an appropriate course to take this forward. I would like to thank all those who gave evidence to the committee, my fellow committee members for their robust scrutiny of the bill, and of course to the very efficient clerking team and the support which they provided to me as the convener and the rest of the committee. I move that the Parliament agrees the City of Edinburgh Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill to be passed. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Bruce Crawford to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill Committee, I am pleased to contribute in the final stage debate today. Although, after listening to John and his full explanation of what this was all about, I am not sure there is a great deal much more we can add to this, but it did strike me that when I speak to school groups in the future about my experience in the Scottish Parliament, I will be able to draw great contrast and diversity in my job, from going from discussing matters of the future of Scotland to the statues on Leith Walk, or being involved in the Independence Referendum Bill Committee as a convener, to serving on this particular Bill Committee. It's quite a contrast we get to do. I would, however, like to take this opportunity to thank all of those who gave evidence to our committee, either in person or in writing. I do that on this occasion because, unfortunately, I wasn't in a position to contribute in the debate on the 21st of January. I'd also like to thank John Lamont for doing an excellent job chairing this committee, my fellow committee members and the committee clerks. Now, of course, if the Sunday papers are in to go by, and if John gets his way, he'll no longer be in this place in the future and won't be able to be in a position to convene such important and august committees of the Scottish Parliament. But back to the bill itself. As we all know, the bill looked at the proposals for a statue on Leith Links in recognition of the golfer John Rattray. And during our evidence-taking sessions, I was particularly taken by the evidence produced by Pat Densler, who was the chair of the John Rattray Statutory Committee. She gave us a fantastic insight into the history of Leith Links and the very good reasons why John Rattray had been chosen as a subject for the statue. John Rattray is a wonderful choice for a statue, a talented golfer, as John Lamont's already described, who was instrumental in setting down the rules of golf, but we also learned he was so much more. Again, as John said, he was in Bonnie Prince Charlie's surgeon during the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion, but he was also a fantastic archer and won the prestigious Edinburgh Arrow on 2 occasions, as well as being a clan chief. A quite remarkable man. And as I noted during my contribution during the evidence-taking sessions of the committee, I think actually his story would make a fabulous plot for perhaps a James Robertson novel, such as the colour of the character. But during stage 1, on a more serious note, I asked for clarification on why the Council had decided to proceed with a private bill route instead of the approach taken, for instance, with a National Gallery extension on Princes Street. And the City Council representatives were able to explain the reasons behind that. The need for this approach was because there was a restriction on existing private legislation to the construction and Leith Links of buildings, including monuments. Now, while certain categories of buildings are permitted, monuments are not, and really there was no way to get round this other than bring forward primary legislation that either expressly or implicitly amends that restriction. And I'm glad that the community of Leith have been so involved in the process. Also, we heard that there were over 400 residents involved in the plans, as well as public information meetings, which were held to inform local people. I think the statue will be a fantastic addition to Leith Links, enhancing the landscaping, acting as a reminder of the history of the area. Now, obviously, as John described well, the second part of the bill dealt with the surplus fire fund, and I think it is right that we've opened this fund to many more areas across the Edinburgh Council area. It will allow applications from those who have been affected by fire and change the conditions which have meet the financial support, and will also allow hospitals, for instance, to get support in their burns units for extra facilities, etc. So all in all, this is a good piece of work done by the committee, and I commend those who brought forward the bill for doing so, and I will be supporting it, obviously, at decision time.
Thank you very much. And now call on Malcolm Chisholm, 4 minutes or thereby, after which we'll move to the closing speech.
Presiding officer, it's slightly surreal in a kind of way, moving on to this debate from previous controversies. It's perhaps the perfect antidote, having dealt with the main controversy of the age, actually introduced by Bruce Crawford, the issue of a currency and an independent Scotland. And now we come to this bill, which, as far as I know, has absolutely nobody opposing it, and certainly people in my constituency widely welcoming it. I did have 2 people on Twitter who objected to the use of public funds for the proposed statute, but when I explained there were no public funds involved, their mild opposition dissolved. So I think the Parliament, I'm sure the Parliament will unite in supporting this bill at decision time. Of course, although the bill is without controversy, John Rattray, as previous speakers have indicated, wasn't, because I suppose who would be King of Scotland was the equivalent political controversy of the early 18th century to the big constitutional debates of today. And John Rattray was a Jacobite, not just a Jacobite, but a surgeon, an archer and a golfer. And I think it will be difficult to find anybody at any point in Scottish history who combines those 4 attributes. He's certainly an important part of Leith history, and that's why people in Leith are pleased that a statue is going to be erected to him. Leith Links, of course, is an important focal point for Leith history more generally, for various reasons, but in the context of this bill, because it can certainly claim to be one of the first places where golf was played in the world, and certainly it was the first place which led to the formation of the rules of golf. It was the City of Edinburgh Council, who happened to be the sponsor of this bill, who offered a silver club to the winner of a golf competition on Leith Links on the condition that the rules were written down. As it happened, John Rattray won the competition, but the club was only awarded because the rules were written down, and that's why we have the Leith Rules Golf Society today. And Pat Densler has been mentioned by Bruce Crawford, and we should certainly pay tribute to the way in which she has driven forward this campaign. If I can just generalise it for 1 minute, I think it is, John Rattray is, and Leith Links Golf and Leith Links more generally are, an important part of Leith history, and I think there is definitely a very strong feeling in Leith about its history, and that's evidenced by the growing support for a museum in Leith. There have been people campaigning for that for several years now, but I've noticed a much wider coalition of Leith residents now campaigning for that, and I've written to the Cabinet Secretary, who I see sitting there, about this matter more than once, but most recently a few days ago. So people feel very interested and in Leith history, and I think that is often attached to particular occasions. In this case, Leith Links and golf. The other issue that I've been dealing with recently because of local concerns is the whole issue of the shore, which of course is the historic port of the city of Edinburgh, and there was a campaign for the basins of the water of Leith to achieve scheduled monument status. That unfortunately was rejected by Historic Scotland, but we're now pursuing that. I'm supporting local residents who are pursuing that in the context of being a stronger conservation area. So there is a great feeling for the history of Leith, and certainly erecting a statue to John Ratley will be a small but significant part of recognising the history of Leith. Now, I've got 30 seconds left, 20 in fact, just to say that I obviously support the second part of the bill. The Surplus Fire Fund, the scope of it is going to be extended to attract more applications for grants and awards and benefit a wider range of people. And I certainly don't know anybody in Leith, Edinburgh or anywhere else who would object to that. So I commend the whole bill and thank the committee for the very thorough way in which they heard the evidence and have presented their conclusions today.
Many thanks. And I now call on Sandra White to wind up the debate on behalf of the committee. Sandra White, 4 minutes, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, as Deputy Convener, I am happy to be closing this debate for the Bill Committee today. Firstly, I would also like to thank those who have contributed to the scrutiny of the bill by providing oral and written evidence. Thanks also to the clerks of the committee for their assistance, and of course my fellow members, John Lamont, Bruce Crawford and Anne McTaggart, for all their help throughout the bill procedure. The committee convener has very helpfully set out the background to this bill and the committee's consideration of its broad principles and consideration stage. Before turning to once again highlight the benefits of the bill, I would like to touch briefly on a procedural aspect of the committee's work which has thus far not been covered. As well as considering the general principles of the bill, private bill committees must also take a view as to whether the bill should proceed as a private bill, and to this end the committee had to satisfy itself that the bill conforms with standing order requirements in relation to the definition of a private bill, and that the accompanying document were adequate to allow proper scrutiny of the bill. On the first point, the committee was satisfied that the bill complies with the standing order definition of a private bill. We were also satisfied that the bill confers on the promoter powers in excess of the general law. And on the second point, the committee was required to consider each of the accompanying documents, that is, the promoter's memorandum, explanatory notes and the promoter's statement, and take a view as to whether these documents were fit for purpose. For example, we considered whether the promoter's statement contained sufficient information on how consent had been gained from organisations affected by the bill. The committee was of the view that overall the accompanying documents were adequate to allow for scrutiny of the bill. Now, if we just turn to the benefits of the bill, and I would like to thank all the contributions so far, but particularly thank Malcolm Chisholm for his contribution for the history of John Ratley and the Leith Links, and the contribution that Leith Links made to the history of golf. Malcolm Chisholm and I had a conversation, the last aspect of the bill, and I'm sure that once again I may see Mr Chisholm and his granddaughter in the Leith Links, enjoying the Leith Links and perhaps, as I said before, enjoying a game of golf on the Leith Links. Now, to return to the attributions of the Leith Links and what this will bring to it, the statue will be an attractive addition to Leith Links. The statue will promote awareness of the rich history of golfing on the links, and the community of Leith will certainly benefit because the statue will attract visitors who will make use of other facilities and businesses in the area. Now, the Surplus Fire Fund has been touched on, and this bill will revitalise what has become a dormant fund. The changes to the purposes for which the fund can be applied will improve its use by encouraging more applications from individuals affected by fire than have been applying, because their injuries will no longer deemed to have been serious. Allowing claims for damage to domestic premises and household contents, where in many cases those applying will not be insured, a very welcome addition to this bill. Expressively allowing provisions of grants to burns units caring for people resident in the City of Edinburgh Council area. The transfer of the fund to eVote is something which should mention. Enable them to refer organisations within the large network that they work with to the fund, which eVote believe will have a cumulative impact on other charitable organisations and individuals. Make use of the wide experience of the trustees within eVote in ensuring that the fund is used to best effect. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I believe that both purposes of this bill will provide only benefits to the community, and on behalf of the committee, I am happy to recommend to Parliament that the bill be passed at decision time. Thank you.
Many thanks. And that concludes the debate on the City of Edinburgh Council, Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 09001 in the name of Christina McKelvey on the report on EU engagement and scrutiny of the committees of the Scottish Parliament on European Union policies. I would invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now. And if you are ready, I now call on Ms McKelvey to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the European and External Relations Committee, 14 minutes or thereby.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am delighted to speak on behalf of the European and External Relations Committee on our report, which details how we and other parliamentary committees have engaged on European issues over the last year and what the priorities for EU security scrutiny is for the year ahead. And I have to take a wee juncture at this point, Deputy Presiding Officer, to thank the clerks and the clerking team and our person from SPICE, who has been absolutely key to ensuring that we have been on top of all of these issues, well briefed and certainly a well understanding of the impact of any new measures or legislation or directives coming from Europe. I also have to pay tribute to the members of the committee who, on most occasions, we work extremely well together. We seem to have a very Europhile attitude, and I say that across all of my colleagues in the committee. We're very, very committed to the benefits of Europe and how that then has an impact on Scotland. And it would be absolutely remiss of me not to be reflecting back in the last year to not mention our colleague Helen Eadie, who passed away very suddenly from us in the committee. Helen was a very gregarious and committed member of the committee, and sometimes very thoughtful, sometimes very interesting, and many times very sparky contributions to the committee, and we couldn't reflect on the past year without remembering Helen's role in that. Presiding Officer, the coming year looks like it will be an extremely interesting year, with European issues at the forefront of ongoing and probably most debates this week, no doubt. We have the European Parliament elections in May and the appointment of a college of new commissioners over the summer. And as a domestic backdrop to this, there is a small matter of an independent Scotland's membership of the European Union, something that I think we may chat about quite a lot over the next few months. But that's become a key issue in the run-up to Scotland's independence referendum in September. So all in all, EU issues will be the top of the political agenda in 2014, and I look forward to working with all my colleagues across the committee when we look at all of those aspects. And I remember when I was first elected in 2011, after the 2011 election, one of my friends who's not political says to me, so what are you going to be doing now? And I says, I'm going to be chairing the European Committee. And she went, is that no dead boring? And I thought, well, no, I don't think so, and I started to explain it. But I think over the past year or so, or maybe 2 years, we've realised that European issues are far from boring and actually have an impact on our everyday life. And she's a bit more educated now about how Europe impacts on her life too as well. And while we might not all be on the same side when it comes to the independence debate, what is clear to me is that we all share the belief that it is so important that this Parliament engages on European matters, as they have a direct bearing, as I've said, on Scotland and its domestic policies and laws. This Parliament has always believed in the importance of engaging in European matters. This is evidenced in the fact that we have a European Committee, which is a mandatory committee of this Parliament, and that its annual process ensures that the scrutiny of EU policies of direct relevance to Scotland is undertaken effectively. And as I have said before in this chamber, all committees are European committees, and given that we now have the rapporteur system, that seems to be really bedding in. And before I speak about the report in more detail, I want to thank the committees for individual reports on EU engagement. All 8 of our committees this year have been annexed in the report, and I am very grateful for their continued engagement over the years, and the reports received by the committee were particularly informative this year. A lot of very detailed work done on matters affecting Scotland. Furthermore, I would like to emphasise that this year has seen a strengthening of our engagement on the scrutiny of EU issues, and I would want to explain for the record the reason why this is the case. This year we developed the scope of the process of asking committees to draw on the Europe 2020 agenda and the Scottish Government's Action Plan on European engagement, as well as on the European Commission's work programme when considering potential EU issues which would merit further scrutiny. The Commission's work programme is an extremely useful document, but given the upcoming European elections in May and the limited time available for these elections for the Parliament to consider the legislative programmes, it is a less detailed document this year than it usually is. As I already mentioned, this year committees were asked to consider the Europe 2020 strategy, which is the EU's strategy for boosting sustainable economic growth and creating new jobs, which is underpinned by 5 key targets covering employment, innovation, education, social inclusion, climate and energy policies. The committee has also referred to the Scottish Government's most recent national reform programme, which set out the actions which has been agreed to support the delivery of the Europe 2020 policies. And lastly, committees were also invited this year to consider the Scottish Government's Action Plan on European Engagement, which gives details of the Scottish Government's 4 priority areas in relation to EU policies. These are energy and climate change, the marine environment, including fisheries, research and creativity, and freedom, security and justice. By also considering the Euro 2020 strategy and the Scottish Government's Action Plan on European engagement, I believe that the committees of this Parliament have recognised the trend towards intergovernmental policy coordination in the EU and have taken a more meaningful and effective approach to EU scrutiny than one which is purely focused on EU legislative proposals. I would like to thank my committee's continued role in mainstreaming the EU issues across all committees, and we have a Brussels bulletin just about at every meeting, and there's always something in that we can refer on to one of our other subject committees in the Parliament, and we make a point of doing that. This year we invited other committees to evidence sessions on issues such as anti-trafficking, European funding, which we knew would be of interest to all. We also heard from the Lithuanian ambassador on Lithuania's priorities in holding the presidency of the European Council, and from the Croatian ambassador on Croatia's path to becoming an EU member state. We conducted work on the new programming period for the European Structural and Investment Funds and how the programmes would be rolled out across Scotland. I also led a delegation along with my convener colleague Maureen Watt from the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, too many acronyms. Maureen Watt and I travelled to Brussels with a number of EU rapporteurs to attend meetings looking at the revised EU public procurement directives, and we try to mirror that with the work that's been done here in the Scottish Government's plans for public procurement too. These directives do have a direct impact on the Scottish Government's procurement reform bill, and hopefully what we have learned when we were in Brussels will help us to inform some of the process when it comes before the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee at the time. Obviously, any procurement or any legislation that comes from Europe has to be transposed into Scots law at a later date, and we hopefully we've informed that process a bit better, not just for ourselves but for other committees. My committee has continued to highlight European legislative proposals where subsidiarity concerns have been raised, and has fed its views on potential improvements on how to deal with such proposals back to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, which is currently looking at the standing orders issue, rules under which committees deal with these types of issues when they come up. And we had some debate about how the Scottish Parliament is notified, and we raised that formally with the House of Lords EU Committee and their inquiry too. We've taken an active interest in a number of EU issues, a number of which have been on subject committees' radars, such as EU funding, justice matters and climate change. And given what Justice and Home Affairs opt-outs come up soon, that's one that's had a particular focus. As members are all too aware, 2013 was the year that the multi-annual financial framework for EU-funded programmes for the next 7 years to 2020 was being prepared, and our committee, along with the Economy, Energy and Tourism, and the Local Government and Regeneration Committee and the Infrastructure and Climate Investment Committee have kept a keen eye on these preparations, asking questions around SMEs and access to EU competitive funding streams. We raised concerns about the implications of cuts to the Connecting Europe facility, which covers broadband. This is a huge issue for people living in rural areas, and we've asked the Scottish Government to keep us up to date on their discussions. I think that other members of the committee will certainly raise that as an issue too. The next point to highlight is the ongoing work being done by the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee on the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy. Agricultural and fisheries issues are always a hot topic when it comes to Scotland, and certainly there's a keen interest by a number of members of the committee, and it is reassuring to see that the Rural Affairs and Climate Change and Environment Committee are continuing to scrutinise the key policy which directly affect and support and the support available to Scotland's farmers, crofters and fishermen. And I have to pay tribute to Jamie McGregor, because he never misses a moment to bring that up in our committee and make sure that any information that we receive is fed back to the Rural Affairs Committee and back and forward thus far. Justice matters, as I said earlier, have featured heavily this year, not least because of the UK's imminent 2014 opt-out decision, a matter which my committee and the Justice Committee are continuing to consider, and the implications of this decision on Scotland. And I'm sure that my colleague Rod Campbell, who has kept a keen eye on this, will have something to say about this later. This year we have built on our previous work on anti-trafficking, an area of particular interest to me. The importance of eradicating the human tragedy associated with trafficking is uppermost in my mind and many other members in this chamber. And next year we will monitor the work of the UK Interdepartmental Ministerial Group on Human Trafficking, and we will follow the development and process of the UK's Modern Slavery Bill. It seems to be pretty slow, but we'll follow it anyway. Climate change, again, has been an area of interest and subject of rigorous scrutiny by all 4 committees. This isn't a surprise to me, given the ambitious climate change reduction targets which Scotland has signed up to. Thankfully, this Parliament, shares the view across the chamber that tackling the impact of climate change for future generations is something that we take very seriously indeed. And we don't need to look much further than how some of our friends and family in Somerset are suffering right now, with what I believe is the impact of climate change on people suffering floods and storms. I think it will take effort from everyone in the Scottish Parliament and from Europe 2020 climate change targets to be met. So the work done by these committees on the Scottish Government's second report on proposals and policies setting out how these targets will be met has been invaluable. The recognition, when we went to Brussels on that trip to talk about procurement, the recognition of where Scotland is at with its climate change targets and the process that it's taken to get there is extremely high, and lots of people wanted to speak to us about that. So it's always something we forget sometimes if we're looking in too much, not to look out and see that other people are interested in what we are doing here as well, and we should evangelise that a wee bit. I am particularly reassured that such an important area will continue to be scrutinised by your parliamentary committees over the next term. So what happens next? Of course.
Would the member agree with me that the Climate Change Act that everybody in the Parliament agreed to, that having missed our first 2 sets of emissions targets, annual targets, that we have to go even further in relation to specific targets and particularly the monitoring of them throughout committees if climate change is to be mainstreamed through the committees?
Christina McKelvey.
I think you do raise a very important point. We have set ourselves very high standards, and I think the role of the committees is to scrutinise that, and that's why I've lingered a bit on the climate change aspects, because we all know that we have set very high standards and we have to work very hard to meet those, and I don't see that pressure being let up at all by anyone across the chamber. So, very important issue indeed, especially when we're looking at what's happening around the UK right now. So what happens next? It is important that we end the debate today to continue to prioritise our engagement with the European Union, the impact its policies have in Scotland, and continue to scrutinise the Scottish Government on EU matters of direct relevance to Scotland's domestic policies and legislation. And we will continue to do that. I'm sure all the committees will continue to do that. While we may not all agree on how Scotland's interests are best served, I am sure that we can all agree that the European Union and its policies have a direct impact on the work that we do here in this Parliament, and it is therefore encouraging that this year we have all continued to engage on matters of direct relevance to the people of Scotland. We must continue to do so throughout the coming year, and I have absolutely no doubt, working with the colleagues I have on my committee, that we would do that anyway. So in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, I hope that the Parliament finds our report both informative and interesting, hopefully not boring, and I look forward to hearing discussions around EU issues of importance across all subject areas over the course of this afternoon. And on that point, I move the motion in my name.
Many thanks. Many thanks. I now call on Fiona Hislop, 10 minutes, or thereby a generous 10 minutes, in fact.
Presiding Officer, I would like to begin by thanking the European and External Relations Committee for organising this annual debate on EU priorities. This provides the opportunity for government, members and committees to come together to identify mutual points of cooperation and key areas for action. I'd also like to thank the committee clerks for the report they've prepared. It will not only be the basis for the debate this afternoon, but also an invaluable point of reference on Scotland's priorities in the EU throughout the year ahead. The work of the committee has become even more significant in the current political climate. Firstly, the UK Prime Minister has given notice of his party's intention to seek to renegotiate the EU treaties with the purpose of holding an in-out referendum in the UK on that basis. There is a real possibility, therefore, if Scotland remains with the UK, of being removed from the EU by a future UK government. Secondly, there is, of course, the referendum taking place in September this year. This will give the Scottish electorate the chance to decide whether it should be for the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government to represent Scotland in the EU and its institutions, or whether they should remain with the Westminster Parliament and the UK Government. It is in this climate that it is more important than ever that the Scottish Parliament considers not only its priority areas for influencing the development of EU law and policy, but also the means by which it influences them. I'd like to start, however, by first addressing the comments made by Mr Barroso. Mr Barroso recognises the democratic right of the people of Scotland to determine our own future. Secondly, Mr Barroso indicated that in continuing as a member of the European Union, an independent Scotland would require the approval of all member states. As a government, we have set out our preferred route for Scotland to continue as a member of the EU through a treaty amendment under Article 48 of the Treaty on European Union. And as we have already stressed, this requires the consent of all of the other member states. And this leads me to Mr Barroso's third point, where he implies some impossibility about the process of Scotland continuing as a member. From an expansionist EU, which accepted East Germany almost overnight, 16 further member states, through the enlargement process since 1990, and where the negotiations lasted only a matter of months with respect to Finland, Sweden and Denmark. An independent Scotland will not, however, be a new country which has never been part of the EU. We need to be clear, Scotland and its citizens have been an integral part of the EU for 40 years, and our situation cannot be compared with any other states which have never been part of the EU. All of the member states recognise the contribution that Scotland has made to the EU during this period. And Mr Barroso himself has defined the values of the European Union as freedom, democracy, the rule of law and solidarity. When the people of Scotland vote in the independence referendum, they will be exercising their democratic freedom in a consensual legal process. In the event of a yes vote, is anyone seriously suggesting that the EU would abandon its founding principles and seek to remove 5 million EU citizens against their will? So I'm not surprised, therefore, that the Commission have now sought to clarify Mr Barroso's comments. And the bottom line is that the European Union is founded on democracy, and Mr Barroso's comments on Scotland fundamentally undermine the founding pillars of the EU. Today, Presiding Officer, I have published a paper entitled Scotland's Priorities for EU Reform, which follows on from our engagement with the UK Government's review of the balance of competences between the EU and the UK.
Secretary moves off that point. I was interested to hear her comments on Mr Barroso's comments. So following that remark, it is a democracy. If other European citizens, along with Mr Barroso, believe that Scotland should no longer be a member of the Schengen Agreement, would the Cabinet Secretary believe that Scotland should still be a member of the EU?
Cabinet Secretary, if you want.
In regards to Scotland's proposals, I think in terms of the continuity of effect, no detriment, understanding the points on which the EU has been based, I think the respect for the democratic decision by the people of Scotland will be paramount. And that, indeed, is the comments that have been made so far from other member countries and member states. And I think it is important to remember it's the member states who, I think, have the focus in this area. And therefore, I think greater study of Article 48 would be useful for the member. Can I move on to our response to the UK Government's review of the balance of competences between the EU and the UK? Our review of the exercise of EU competence has demonstrated just how deeply integrated into the EU that Scotland is. As well as benefiting enormously from being part of the EU, Scotland makes a significant contribution to the EU in terms of finance, economic growth, industry, education and innovation, as well as social justice. Scotland is an integral and part of the single market, and it is seriously wrong to think that that would be broken up simply because an existing nation within its membership chooses to follow a democratic process and govern its own affairs. And the simple fact is in everyone's interest throughout the whole of the EU for the people of Scotland to remain a part of the EU. That is the reality of the situation. And our paper also highlights more than ever the importance of Scotland being in a position to influence the development of EU law and policy. And that is why it has identified identified a number of priority areas which Scotland should seek to influence the reform of EU law and policy from within the existing framework of the EU treaties and institutions. And unlike the UK Prime Minister, I do not consider that a complete renegotiation of the EU treaties is necessary in order to achieve the necessary reforms. And I'd like to focus on some of the issues highlighted by the Committee's report on EU priorities. These echo the conclusions of our examination of the exercise of EU competencies and again demonstrate the importance of both the EU to Scotland as well as Scotland to the EU. It also demonstrates how we are all working constructively within the current constitutional settlement to ensure that Scotland's priorities are taken into account. And as a starting point, it is clear that the new round of European structural and competitive funding will play a major role in helping us to tie together better skills and business development, to commercialise a world-class research base and to support major infrastructure projects. I'm grateful to all of the committees which have played a role in making the acquisition of structural and competitive funding one of their key priorities for 2014. And the Scottish Government played a key part in securing £1.3 billion of EU funding between 2007 and 2013 and shares the committee's ambitions to draw down even more funding at this crucial juncture, the year of a new European Commission and a new European Parliament. And we're also pleased that the Commission Work Programme for 2014 continues to prioritise our young people's futures. The £50 million Youth Employment Scotland Fund is made up of £15 million from the Scottish Government and £10 million from the European Social Fund, matched by £25 million worth of in-kind support from employers and local councils. And up to 10,000 young people are expected to be supported into work. It's a case in point of what can be achieved when government, local government, Parliament and the European institutions work together. And I'd like to highlight the positive focus on Scotland's economic future post-2014, and the committee work this year on the economic benefits of membership of international institutions will be greatly valued and demonstrates the importance of Scotland's position in the EU. 46% of our international exports go to EU member states. That equates to £11 billion of Scottish exports. Scotland is also a growing part of the European economy. Since 2006, the value of Scottish exports to the EU has increased by 35.1%. We are concerned, however, that Europe will not be able to achieve the reforms necessary to increase economic growth unless it can also demonstrate that these gains lead to a fitter, more equal, more inclusive society. I would also like to acknowledge the work of the committees in relation to social issues. E-health continues to be a source of European cooperation, and the first European Telehealth Conference, held in Edinburgh last October, demonstrates the key role that Scotland plays in this field. And work as identified from committees in the Parliament with the Roma community also highlights the importance of EU action in this area. We have recently published an update, Presiding Officer, of the annexes to our action plan for engagement with the EU on our 4 key areas: energy and climate change, as referred to by the committee convener, the marine environment, research and creativity, and the area of freedom, security and justice. We are also keeping a very close eye as to how recent reforms on the common agricultural and fisheries policies will work in practice. And we've also worked constructively with the UK Government in seeking to ensure that Scotland's priorities are communicated in the EU institutions. Scottish ministers have been active in attending meetings of the Council of Ministers relating to their policy areas. Frustratingly, however, our ministers are still not able to secure speaking rights in some councils which fall into our priority areas. The Scottish Government is committed to doing all it can in all our priority areas, but we're mindful that our sphere of influence is limited, as it is the UK's role to represent Scotland before the EU institutions. Depending on the outcome of next UK parliamentary election, the UK Government may be pursuing a very separate agenda to renegotiate the treaties. And that is why I'm so keen for Scotland to play a direct role in the development of EU law and policy as an independent member state. And in the paper Scotland's Future, the Government set out the process by which an independent Scotland could smoothly become an independent member state within the EU, participating fully in the EU institutions and playing a key role in the development of EU law and policy. And just think of the impact that an independent Scotland speaking with its own voice in the EU institutions could have. States of a similar size and smaller size in Scotland have already played a significant role in the EU. And during my visit to Denmark last year, I was struck by its confidence on the international stage. The Scandinavian member states are the paradigm examples of this, but there are also many other member states which actively influence the direction in which the EU is travelling. The 3 previous EU presidencies, Cyprus, Ireland and Lithuania, were all held by countries smaller in size and population than Scotland, and we were very impressed by the recent Lithuanian presidency. The multi-financial framework legislative package was approved, significant progress on the banking union was made, 2.5 times more legal documents than the average were agreed, Moreover, their calm stewardship in a time of political unease showed the positive impact that smaller states can have on the international stage. The Scottish Government therefore shares the interest that the European and External Relations Committee has shown in similar-sized states in its evidence session 2 weeks ago, and there are plenty of opportunities for further engagement, for example, with Latvia and Luxembourg, populations far less than Scotland, which will each hold the EU presidency in 2015. To conclude, this debate is an excellent opportunity to put on the record the strong contribution that Scotland's Parliament, as well as Scotland's Government, is making to Europe's future. The current constitutional settlement in the UK, however, means that Scotland does not have its own voice in the major EU institutions. Just imagine what we could actively influence in terms of the priorities highlighted by the Committee's report, had we the means to do so. Do we want to positively influence the direction of the EU, or are we content for the current UK Prime Minister to increase our isolation from the rest of the continent? And that, Presiding Officer, is a choice of the two futures facing Scotland.
Thank you very much. Now call on Patricia Ferguson, 8 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking Christina McKelvey, the convener of the European Committee, for her very kind words about our late colleague Helen Eadie. Helen Eadie was indeed a committed European and a committed socialist, and her view of Europe was of the opportunities that it afforded for her and others like her to be able to improve the lot of the people of Fife and the people of Scotland and, of course, the people of UK. She was committed to that, and I think her legacy will live on for a very long time indeed. So the convener is to be thanked for raising that particular issue. And it is indeed quite strange, in fact, to be debating Europe and not to have Helen sitting up the back, ready to pounce if one of us gets something wrong. But there is absolutely no doubt, Presiding Officer, that this Parliament takes issues relating to the European Union very seriously indeed. And that assertion is demonstrated by the fact that the European and External Affairs Committee is a mandatory committee of the Parliament, as the convener mentioned. But so wide-reaching is the impact of the European Union that the issues it discusses and the policies it adopts must be of interest and importance to all the committees of this Parliament. Which is why a report such as the one we debate today is vital, gathering together as it does the actions of all the Parliament's committees and distilling them into one document. But like all other committees of the Parliament, the European Committee is also responsible for scrutinising the work of the Scottish Government and, in our case, its engagement externally and, in the context of this report, its engagement with the European Union. And it's fair to say that the way in which the European Committee gathers together that information has improved over time and is something that our committee hopes will further evolve so that the importance of the EU to domestic policy and legislation can be fully integrated into the work of all the Parliament's committees. This is a process which began in 2010 when the Parliament agreed to introduce a Parliament-wide strategy for EU engagement and scrutiny. And at that time, we also agreed as a Parliament that this should be done by adopting an early engagement approach to mainstream the scrutiny of the draft EU legislation in the work of subject committees and to mainstream also the monitoring of the transposition and implementation of legislation into the work of our subject committees. As the convener has already said, this year's approach developed that way of working further by asking subject committees to look at both the work they have done and the plans they have for the coming year, so that Parliament can take a more strategic approach. This is particularly important, I would argue, in relation to the work that most committees will want to do in relation to the Europe 2020 strategy and the Scottish Government's action plan on European engagement. I think that is the right approach, and I very much hope that the subject committees have found it useful to their work too. But of course, all of our discussions in this area, which must take place against the backdrop of the European elections, which take place in May, as we know, and of course the European Commission's work plan, understandably focuses on those legislative proposals already announced and those which are likely to be agreed before those elections take place. The work plan identifies access to finance, the banking union, the single market and the digital agenda as priorities, and also considers the multi-annual financial framework for 2014-2020 as of real importance in order to ensure that organisations and businesses can benefit from investment and from European programmes without unnecessary delay. But of course, the Parliament must also look at the way in which the Scottish Government engages with and relates to the EU. And I wasn't perhaps going to mention this in today's debate, Presiding Officer, but given that the Cabinet Secretary spent more than half of her speech talking about Mr Barroso and issues concerning an independent Scotland's membership of the EU, I make no excuse for now turning to that area. Because the European Committee is currently undertaking an inquiry into the nature of an independent Scotland's relationship with Europe. And I actually had thought that would be a debate for another day. However, it's been raised, and I'll now take this opportunity to urge the Scottish Government to be more frank with Parliament before we conclude our inquiry, to tell us once and for all what legal advice they've had about Scotland's possible membership of the European Union, something that up until now they have actually suggested is not in the public interest. Well, I'm sorry, but if that's not in the public interest, what actually is?
Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop.
The member will recall her answer as a minister in this Parliament about legal advice and recognising that governments do not either recognise whether there has been legal advice requested or the content of that legal advice. She answered that as a minister in this Parliament.
I would absolutely accept that, but I would suggest to the Cabinet Secretary that the context is entirely different. We're being asked to make what the Scottish Government would argue is a once-in-a-lifetime, no, once-in-a-300-years decision. Now, that decision is of prime importance to the everyday lives of the people of this country. And I think on that basis, in this instance, the Scottish Government really does need to think about this and publish this particular set of legal advice. And I think anyone who tries to excuse that by citing previous examples in the way that Ms Hislop has tried to do just underestimates the power of the particular question that we're discussing. But I would like to know from the Scottish Government too, because we've learned today that membership of the euro is a red line issue, apparently, for those negotiations. But we need to know what other red lines there might be. Would the rate of VAT, for example, be a red line issue? These are the things that the people of Scotland want to know. So if you won't tell us what your legal advice is, perhaps you could tell us what your red line areas are for negotiation. I don't really think that that's too much to ask. So we also, Presiding Officer, as a Parliament, have to consider the information and the work done by the subject committees of this Parliament, as I have mentioned earlier. And I think it's very interesting to read about those. And we also want to measure those against the areas which the Scottish Government itself has identified as being its priorities for that particular piece of work. And those priority areas are actually listed in the European Committee's report on page 4, and as we've heard, comprise energy and climate change, marine environment, research and creativity, and freedom, security and justice. Now, in a debate such as this, Presiding Officer, it's always difficult to cover all of the many issues that one would wish to, and I will return to many of the specific issues identified by subject committees in my closing speech. But there are a number of areas that I think are worth flagging up just at this point. The first, of course, is EU funding, and we know that that can be difficult to access. And it is the responsibility of the Scottish Government to take whatever steps it can to assist, particularly in those areas such as structural, cohesion, rural development and fisheries funds, where the money is allocated directly to Scotland. And the scrutiny of subject committees in this regard is particularly important, I would argue. Another area which has attracted particular interest in the European Committee, as the convener rightly identified, is the digital agenda, an interest shared, of course, with the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, particularly in connection to rural areas, but also, I would have to argue, for those parts of our towns and cities where access can also sometimes be difficult. Now, the area of trafficking is one which particularly engages my party, and I know the convener shares our concern about this. We have real concerns about how trafficking will be prevented, particularly in this year coming. And I very much hope that the Scottish Government will agree to back my colleague Jenny Mara's bill on the subject, thank you, Presiding Officer, which has garnered cross-party support and which was introduced today. Presiding Officer, as I mentioned, there are many other issues I would wish to cover. I certainly look forward to returning to those at the end of the debate. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jamie McGregor. 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. With great respect to the Cabinet Secretary, since she's mentioned it, members will forgive me, I hope, for opening with a reference to the most definitive statement yet regarding Scotland's membership of the EU, should she separate from the rest of the UK family. Now, I make no apologies, therefore, for drawing attention to José Manuel Barroso's comments on Sunday, where he said categorically on television, our position in the EU could not be guaranteed following a vote for separatism. Extremely difficult, if not impossible, were his words. Now, this man not only has been Prime Minister of Portugal. No, I'm going to go on for a bit. He's also done 2 terms as President of the European Commission. I think everybody would agree, a man of very considerable consequence. Now, surely he's worth listening to. No, I don't think I will at this point. Now, I just think he is consistent on this, as was his predecessor, Romana Prodi, who as long ago as 2004 said that an independent Scotland would not automatically be a member of the EU. But these arguments will go on other days, and I relish the opportunity of crossing swords with the committee convener, the Cabinet Secretary, all the SNP committee members on this crucial point. Our inquiry into EU membership seems to be exposing, along with the statements, no, not at the moment, the myths perpetrated by those who argue we can simply expect a warm welcome from all our European partners and all will be well on the night, because according to leading experts, it won't. Today's debate draws attention to the workings of the European and External Relations Committee report on EU engagement with regard to how the various committees of this Parliament interact with EU policies. Now, that might sound a bit dull, but let me say that our committee provides a very useful function in scrutinising what comes out of Europe and how it relates to our businesses in a devolved Parliament. Now, can I thank the convener and the clerks for their extremely hard work in preparing the report and the diligence of the Parliament's other committees for their role in identifying what should be our priorities in EU matters. And I recognise that all of the Parliament's committees have busy work programmes, and therefore it is commendable that they've found time to consider issues which are relevant to domestic policies and legislation. At the heart of this report is the emphasis on a commitment made by the Scottish Parliament in 2010 that there should be a focus on European affairs. And I have to say that during my time on this committee, we've demonstrated how successful we've been in scrutinising the approach taken by the Scottish Government in EU matters, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary would acknowledge the key role we've played in holding the Scottish Government to account. No bad thing when one considers recent developments. And I've consistently argued that while the 5 areas of particular interest, energy, climate change, marine environment, including fisheries, research and creativity, and freedom, security and justice, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary would acknowledge the key role we have played in holding the administration to account on these things. And there is still room, in my view, for a degree of expansion. In particular, I would reiterate agriculture, farming and food production as crucial spheres which we cannot ignore, and therefore I would once again implore the Cabinet Secretary to explain why these are not identified as priority areas of huge significance. The report highlights the contribution made by Scottish ministers in their attendance at various committee meetings, where they have contributed to discussions on EU issues which have an impact on domestic affairs, such as the Scottish Government's budget. The Parliament's committees have hosted a range of specialist guests, for example, the visit by Johannes Hahn, the EU Commissioner for Regional Policy, who met with the Local Government and Regeneration Committee in September of last year. I understand that a range of issues were raised, such as the changes to the EU structural and investment funds and revisions to EU procurement directives. These are crucial areas to Scotland. The importance of the European Committee has been demonstrated in recent months by the attendance, both in October of 2013, of the Lithuanian ambassador and also the Croatian ambassador, the latter coming soon after Croatia's accession to the EU. We look forward to the evidence session scheduled for next month, when the Greek ambassador will be joining us. Our committee investigated developments with respect to reforms of the CFP and the CAP, and these were further augmented by the Rural Affairs and Environment Committee, taking evidence from MEPs and Owen Paterson from DEFRA, as well as Richard Lockhead. Where I have to depart from the normal approach taken in committee debates is with reference to the document Scotland's Priorities for EU Reform, which landed on my desk at 9 o'clock this morning. This seems to me a very hastily cobbled together piece of work, perhaps one of the most biased Scottish Government publications I've ever seen. And I can only imagine it was drafted as a direct response to the recent statements coming from the EU, such as that by the President of the Commission. Yes, if I'm allowed to.
Can I make clear, in terms of this is the second semester, we're moving into the third semester, we've been preparing our input. We've already published our first semester's responses. This has been ongoing for months and months and months. This is, I think, a very opportune debate to make sure that we're aligning the EU priorities of the Parliament also with what we see as the government. I think it's the correct thing to do.
Jamie McGregor.
Well, I shall certainly look forward to reading it in more detail. But quite frankly, it looks to me as though the government is looking at clutching at straws, basically, to justify their weak arguments for independence. And I think they demean themselves by putting out a document like that at such a late stage, when we should have been highlighting the committee's work. And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will reflect on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we now move to the open debate, and I call on Willie Coffey to be followed by David Stewart. Mr. Coffey, we have quite a bit of time in hand, so you can have up to 7 minutes or thereby.
Presiding Officer, thank you very much. I think the move by the Parliament to mainstream the consideration of European issues in our committees has been an extremely good one. It's meant that European issues reach a wider audience of members right across the Parliament, and in so doing has brought European affairs very much into sharper focus here in Scotland. We can see from the breadth and depth of contributions made by the committees that they embraced this role very positively, and in so doing have made a valued contribution to the work of the Parliament. And so I think we're indebted to all our colleagues for the work that they've done. The focus for much of our work, of course, is the Commission's work programme and how it impacts on Scotland. The Scottish Government's Action Plan for European Engagement and the National Reform Programme allow us to scrutinise the work being carried out by the Scottish Government in support of the objectives set out in Europe 2020. As the convener said in her speech, we have covered quite a variety of subjects and had several important visits to the committee with some impressive contributions along the way. I'd like to pick out a few themes of particular interest to me and to share some of the input from our committees on those. One of the key themes for me is the digital agenda and how Europe is taking forward the rollout of super-fast broadband. Now, it came as a bit of a shock to me, as it did to my late colleague Helen Eadie, to discover that as part of the cuts to the MAF agreement requested by the UK Government, one of the casualties was a significant cut to the proposed spend on IT infrastructure projects. The impact of this is yet to be determined, but the consequent proposal to shift the focus more towards IT service provision than on the underlying infrastructure must surely hold back the speed of progress in reaching out to our rural and excluded communities across Europe. I note also that the Infrastructure Committee took an interest in this, more, I think, from the perspective of state aid guidelines, but it does show that there's a keen interest in the digital agenda across the committees now. I'm much more encouraged, though, by announcements made here in Scotland to invest further in superfast broadband programmes, with a target to deliver 30 megabits per second everywhere by 2020. And I note too that we are to receive a visit from the Commission's Director General for Communication Networks, Content and Technology, and I'm sure members will be keen to take advantage of this when it happens. Presiding Officer, there can surely be no greater scourge for any country than to have high levels of youth unemployment. Scotland is the only EU country to have a dedicated Minister for Youth Employment, and while our youth unemployment rates have dropped since this was introduced, from around 25 to 19%, in Spain the rate of youth unemployment is an incredible 57%, surely a major cause of concern for that country. So it was with great interest that the committee noted the proposal by the Scottish Government to deploy European Social Fund, ERDF monies and other youth employability measures to further tackle this. In Scotland, we will see an additional €52 million targeted at youth unemployment black spots, particularly in the west of Scotland, and I think this is very welcome indeed. If there's an issue where Europe could and should cooperate, it would surely be in how we tackle human trafficking. Modern-day slavery is alive and kicking, even here in Scotland, and the committee heard from the EU's anti-trafficking coordinator, Miria Vassiliadou, who painted a disturbing picture for us of the extent of this throughout Europe. I know our Cabinet Secretary is keeping a close eye on the UK's modern slavery bill to see how Scotland might apply that here. The full force of the law must be brought to bear on those criminals who exploit their fellow human beings under the most degrading of circumstances. And in my view, a similar warning must go out to those who buy the services from the criminals who supply them. We've heard some discussion about the Scottish Government's White Paper and the evidence sessions that, on this, I would say, have been fairly robust. Differing opinions have been offered, of course, on Scotland's continuing membership after independence, and I would say that I've still to hear from anyone who has given evidence by what mechanism Scotland would suddenly find itself outside of the European Union after independence. I specifically asked this of our two learned QCs and a professor, but none could point to any specific clause within the treaties that would bring this about. For me, and several of those who gave evidence, the pragmatic, cooperative and inclusive approach that is Europe's hallmark will ensure that Scotland is a member of the EU on the first day of independence. I certainly will, yes.
I recognise what Mr Coffey says, but can I ask, what does Mr Coffey make of President Barroso's remarks? Surely he is a moderate and well-intentioned spokesperson. Was he not accurate in his comments?
I think if I had the opportunity, I would have asked him the same question, to point to exactly which clause in the treaty it is that would achieve the effect that he claims will be the effect. And no one's been able to do that. And I would invite any members to tell me which clause it is right now with another intervention. Is the President making it up? Tell me. Is there a clause that would...
Mr McIntosh.
Sorry, I'm not... Are you going to tell me which clause it is that excludes Scotland?
Was Mr Barroso making it up then, in that case?
Well, if he can't answer the question about which clause it is within existing treaties that take Scotland out... It's
through the chair, Mr McIntosh.
Yeah. Presiding Officer, it's the no campaigners who are claiming this, so I think they have to demonstrate by which clause in the treaty they will achieve that effect. Presiding Officer, in closing, European business is playing an increasing role in the work of the Scottish Government and in the Parliament through our committees. The Government's Action Plan and European engagement, the National Reform Programme and the work now of our committees shows that Scotland is engaging positively and in greater depth on European issues. The visits and the planned visits by the ambassadors of those countries holding the presidency of the Council will give us a wonderful opportunity to hear directly about how they see Europe developing and the role that Scotland will play in that. Through all of this work comes the benefit of adding to our own expertise and the reciprocal benefit to our European colleagues by bringing them a Scottish perspective on the work of the European Union. I think we have much to gain, but much to offer, and it's all in great preparation for things to come. And I'm happy to support today's motion in the name of the convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on David Stewart to be followed by Roderick Campbell. 7 minutes or thereby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And like others, could I thank the convener and the members of the European and External Relations Committee for, I think, a very well prepared and informative report, which of course outlines a range of issues relating to EU engagement and scrutiny. And on the onset, Presiding Officer, could I echo Patricia Ferguson's comments and thank the convener for her kind comments about the late Helen Eadie. I think we all recognise Helen's tremendous knowledge of European affairs. Could I also echo comments Patricia Ferguson made about her great experience? I remember her telling me when I first joined the Parliament about how she worked for some time with Jim Callaghan in Number 10. That's some CV going back a number of years. So tremendous experience and tremendous expertise. But, Presiding Officer, the conclusion of this report, I think, highlights the importance and relevance of EU issues and work to domestic policies and legislation. But this afternoon, Presiding Officer, I'd like to focus my remarks, just for a change, some may say, on the importance of EU funding allocated to Scotland through, of course, the ERDF, ESF, rural development and fisheries. And I'd like to focus particularly about the Hands and Islands for obvious reasons. And my view, as I've made this point several times in debates like this over the years, is that these funds have had a very positive impact in my own region in the Hands and Islands. And Jimmy McGregor, I think, made very similar comments, where I think we've had considerable medicine being made to the area's infrastructure. And of course, as members will know, since the 1990s, when the region qualified for enhanced funding through Objective 1, these funds have made a significant contribution to stimulating economic development in the Hands and Islands. But of course, perhaps to make a controversial argument is that, of course, these funds are designed to increase GDP relative to within the UK and, of course, in comparisons to Europe as well. So the long-term plan must be, just to finish this point, Mr Brody, the long-term plan must be to develop the GDP so that the region's at a stage that it doesn't need European structural funds. I do take the point that we're some time off that point yet. Chip Brody.
Chip Brody.
Isn't it the case, thank you for taking the intervention, isn't it the case that we were denied the huge benefits that now we know are there in terms of the Horizon Fund, the COSME Fund, because we had only a limited interface with Europe, high being one, and that we really should be trying to increase the number of accredited organisations to ensure we optimise the benefits which we were denied because we were not a member state.
I'd like to come back to entitlement in just a second or two, if Chick Brodie could live with that, as I think he makes a good point. My overall view is we should, of course, be looking to maximise any funding that we should be getting to not just the Hands Islands, but to Scotland as a whole. So I note, of course, the committee's commitment to undertake fact-finding visits on subject ESI funded programmes across Scotland, and my invitation to the convener today is to consider a visit to the Highlands and Islands if she hasn't already considered that as part of the work programme. And she'll know there's many excellent examples of the difference this funding makes to businesses, communities and individuals. And if you want a couple of examples near where I live, the Keswick Bridge and indeed the Mallig Road were both good examples of funding coupled with other domestic funding which made these projects happen. So previous structural funds investment has made a positive contribution to the region. And just a little bit of history, Presiding Officer, the structural funds programme in the last programme between 2000 and 2006 created or retained 17,000 jobs, assisted more than 9,000 businesses and supported 11,000 trainees. But of course, in the Highlands Islands, there's huge challenges. Due to demanding geography, there's not much you can do with that, arguably, sparsity of population and acute peripherality. And members will know that the Hands and Islands covers a third of Scotland's landmass, an area that's larger than Belgium, with a population smaller than that of Brussels. Demanding geography, with a coastline longer than Brazil and more than 100 inhabited islands. And we all know that depopulation has been a running sore in the Highlands and Islands, particularly in the islands and what I would describe as the super-sparse mainland parts of the Highlands and Islands. But as we approach the new programme period from 2014 to 2020, the Highlands and Islands, with a GDP of 84% of the EU average, qualifies again, rightly in my view, for special treatment as a transition region. This is likely to amount to some €172 million, ring-fenced out of a total Scottish allocation of about €795 million. And I do believe that the EU 2020 goals of a smart, sustainable and inclusive growth are of course as relevant to the Highlands and Islands as they are to the rest of Scotland. However, the distinct challenges and also opportunities for the Highlands and Islands, which are integral to the designation as a transition region, must be directly addressed, building on progress from previous structural funds investment. And again, I would say to the convener, would the convener agree with me that the proposed integrated territorial investment, the ITI approach, which is a mechanism to integrate, manage and deliver the European structural and investment funds in a distinct geographic area, represents the best way forward? Because this ensures that regional stakeholders have a say in how structural funds can be targeted to meet the specific challenges and opportunities for the Highlands and Islands. Jamie McGregor.
I just really wanted to congratulate the member on what he's saying, because I agree with it. But would he agree with me that structural funds which went into, say, the Bernera Causeway, the Eriska Causeway, the Scalpy Bridge, have made enormous differences to those islands, and none of them, I've never heard anybody say we wish we were still an island.
David Stewart.
Well, I think the member's quite right to say that we should be targeting particular problems in our island communities. And if you take another example, say with Western Isles, I've got real concerns about issues around depopulation. And I think any work that could be done to stimulate economic development and keep our young people on islands are crucial. So I agree with the member's points that we should be targeting our island communities because of the distinct problems that they have. But I believe that the ITI will allow for structural funding to be targeted to some strategic priorities of the rest of Scotland, but with sufficient flexibility to ensure they address the specifics of the individual regions. I also like to mention the importance, in the brief time I've got left, Presiding Officer, of allocation of funding. And I do believe, actually, that we did have quite a success in the allocation of funding, because the UK Government, and it's not often I would praise them, Presiding Officer, announced it planned to use its own formula to allocate structural funds, rather than that decided by the EU. But the chosen formula meant that Scotland received more structural fund funding than it would have done under the existing formula, an uplift of around €228 million. So that ensured that the four nations incurred roughly the same cut of around 5% in overall funding. I think I'm in last minute.
I think the member's just concluded. Or have you finished?
If I have time, I was giving way to...
Well, yes, you could give way to Cabinet Secretary.
Just very briefly, he makes a very important point, and will he recognise the role not just of the Scottish Government ministers in arguing that point, but also across the Chamber, a very strong argument from the Scottish Parliament that had to be addressed. David Stewart.
If it's still time, Presiding Officer, could I perhaps raise one issue, though, that members haven't raised that does concern me, and I'm sure the convener is aware of this. I was concerned to find out that Liverpool and Sheffield councils challenged the allocation through the High Court, which recently rules that the cuts in European funding was unlawful. It's not clear whether or how this court judgment will affect the allocation of structural funds in England or across the UK for the next programme, but I do believe that the overall programme that we got for Scotland was a victory, and we should take comfort from that. So finally, Presiding Officer, my overall view is that European funding is not some sort of paternalistic sop from bureaucrats, but it's a crucial economic tool to lever up the UK average for the capital GDP of lagging regions. It provides planning and economic opportunities to exploit emerging markets such as life sciences, renewable energy and the creative industries. And I'm sure the Minister shares my view that transition region status is an important economic tool in overcoming natural handicaps and allowing the region to work with the rest of Scotland in contributing towards the EU 2020 goals of promoting smart, sustainable and inclusive growth in the EU economy.
Many thanks. I now call Roderick Campbell to be followed by Stuart Maxwell. I can give members around 7 minutes with a bit of leeway for interventions.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Justice Committee's EU Rapporteur, I'm pleased to be speaking this debate about the Committee's EU engagement last year and in 2014. The Committee's EU priorities for 2013 remain broadly the same in 2014 as they continue to be significant issues with major implications for Scotland. The first is probably the most significant, the UK Government's 2014 opt-out decision. Protocol 36 of the Lisbon Treaty allows the UK Government to decide by the 1st of May 2014 whether the UK should continue to be bound by around 130 police and criminal justice measures adopted prior to the Lisbon Treaty, or if it should exercise its right to opt out of them all. Either scenario would require to take effect from the 1st of December 2014. The committee's interest in this issue began in October 2012 when the Home Secretary announced at Westminster that the UK Government was likely to exercise the block opt-out. This announcement prompted interest in the House of Lords, and it set up an EU Select Committee to inquire into the opt-out decision. In its inquiry, I'm pleased to say, the EU Select Committee took account of Scottish interest, hearing evidence from the Lord Advocate and receiving written evidence from the Faculty of Advocates, Law Society and ACPOS. One of the main concerns, of course, was that the block opt-out would include the European arrest warrant, a key tool for Scottish prosecutors and police to facilitate arrests across member states. Given the work which was being undertaken down south by this committee, we agreed not to conduct our own inquiry at that time. The House of Lords, of course, reported in April 2013 that the UK Government had not made a convincing case to opt out of the 130 measures, and that to do so would have negative repercussions for the UK's internal security. The Scottish Government agreed with that position. Notwithstanding that, however, the UK Government agreed in July 2013, when this Parliament was in recess, that it intends to proceed with the opt-out and is negotiating to opt back into 35 individual measures. Despite criticism from the House of Lords in October 2013 on the point as to the explanation for the choice of 35 measures. Concerns remain about these measures identified, and of course there could be potential implications if the individual opt-ins are not negotiated by the time the block opt-out comes into effect by the 1st of December. So further debates in Westminster are planned to take place on the issue, and such is the significance of this issue that the Justice Committee itself is taking evidence from the Scottish Government on the 4th of March on the implications for Scotland if the UK Government does only opt in to 35 of the 130 original measures. To inform this evidence session, we have also sought views from the Faculty of Advocates, the Law Society, the Lord Advocate and Police Scotland. And we're looking forward, I think, to an interesting session on the 4th of March. We also have the option of holding a chamber debate in this Parliament on the issue in May, and we'll obviously be monitoring progress in that respect. The second of our EU priorities is the proposal to establish a European Public Prosecutor's Office to focus on protecting the financial interests of the European Union. In September last year, the Justice Committee agreed that it did not comply with the subsidiarity principle, and that decision led to a committee motion on the subsidiarity breach being debated and agreed to by this Parliament for the very first time. A large number of member states submitted reasons opinions against the proposal, triggering a yellow card procedure requiring the EU Commission to review the proposal and to decide whether to maintain, amend or withdraw it. As you all know, no doubt, the Commission has decided nevertheless that it intends to proceed with the proposal without any amendment. Although the UK Government does not intend to opt into this proposal, there may still be implications for Scotland and the UK when cooperating with the EPPO if it were established, and therefore the Committee will continue to monitor developments very closely. The Commission work programmes for 2012 and 2013 both included a proposal on special safeguards in criminal procedures for suspects or accused persons who are vulnerable, and in both years the Committee agreed to include this proposal in its EU priorities. Late last year, however, the Commission published a recommendation on this issue, prompting the Justice Committee to seek the Scottish Government's views on how this recommendation fits in with the provisions in the Criminal Justice Bill, which this Parliament is currently considering. The response from the Scottish Government has confirmed that the provisions in the bill, quote, go some way towards ensuring we comply with the spirit of the recommendation, but that further thought would be given to the issue. That means, I think, that the Justice Committee will continue to monitor this issue. There's a 36-month period in which to inform the Commission of measures taken to give effect to the recommendation, and the Committee, as I said, has therefore agreed to continue to monitor the Scottish Government's progress towards meeting the recommendation. If I might now turn just briefly, as I've got a little time in hand, to the comments made by Ken McIntosh previously in relation to the opinions of Barroso and Van Rompuy. And perhaps I can just refer to the evidence session of the European External Affairs Committee on the 23rd of January and to the evidence that Sir David Edward gave on the point. And what Sir David Edward said is that he's very much a proponent of negotiations. He said there will be a gap in time between the vote and the moment of independence. In that period of time, you will have an obligation to negotiate a solution to the problem. That problem being the absurd situation of EU citizens suddenly being thrust out into a cold world on independence. That has been ignored by Barroso, Van Rompuy and all those who talk about it. My belief is that he could mount a case before the European Court of Justice. Then he goes on to say, am I going to lose my rights at the moment of independence? I do not know what the answer will be, but I'm prepared to bet it will not be the Van Rompuy answer. So I think there's your answer. I think Sir David at least thinks that Barroso and Van Rompuy are wrong. And even those protagonists who take the view, such as Professor Armstrong that day, that Article 49 should prevail, took the view that negotiations should take place following a yes vote, and we should avoid the situation where there is some kind of complete impasse between a yes vote and independence. Yes, by all means.
Ken McIntosh.
Thank you. I accept Mr Campbell's arguments that some experts take a different view. Would Mr Campbell accept the contention that possibly Mr Barroso could be right?
Roger Campbell.
Well, I think I've already said the view. Mr Barroso is currently a civil servant. He's a member of the Commission. His role and the Commission's role is one of consultation. He is not a decision maker, and he will be out of office very shortly. But I would always like to pay some respect to someone who's obviously been in the job for a while. But it seems from press comment overnight that he himself recognises his most recent comments might have been a little hasty.
Thank you. Stuart Maxwell, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of both the Education and Culture Committee and indeed the European Union's Committee of the Regions, I am acutely aware of how our policy priorities in this Parliament often overlap with those of Europe. It is therefore entirely appropriate for us to look at ways to improve our relationship with European policy priorities and to look at how we can better scrutinise and engage with the European Union. The Education and Culture Committee has already incorporated consideration of EU issues on a number of topics in our recent work. We have, for example, taken evidence from witnesses, including the Chief Executive of Creative Scotland, to examine the possibility of applying for European structural funds for filmmaking in Scotland, funding which has already been successfully allocated to other parts of the UK. The committee has also scrutinised the Scottish Government's budget for 2014-15 and asked the Government what progress was being made in accessing structural funding for youth employability and job creation, which were key policy priorities of the Lithuanian presidency of the Council of Europe. Our work programme for the upcoming year includes consideration of the European Union's Europe 2020 policy document and the Scottish Government's response to it. The Scottish Parliament's work on the educational attainment gap could tie in well with the Europe 2020 headline targets for improving education levels and the Youth Guarantee Scheme that ensures education, training or employment opportunities for all 16 to 24-year-olds. The Education and Culture Committee also expects to consider aspects of foreign language teaching. Now, this work could combine aspects of the European and External Relations Committee's recent inquiry into foreign language learning in primary schools. The Scottish Government has developed policies in this area, and I understand that they will provide updates to the European Committee every 6 months. As our committees work through their programmes, it will be of assistance that each committee's EU reporter will continue to look for opportunities to highlight relevant EU issues and raise these issues as appropriate. The objectives set out in Europe 2020 are strongly supported by the Scottish Government through the Scottish Government's National Reform Programme, and I welcome any measures which will help accelerate economic recovery and continue our strong commitment to the education of our young people. The National Reform Programme accurately describes education as being central to our future economic growth. Measures such as free education, maintaining the educational maintenance allowance and providing financial support measures to students will prove to be vital measures in meeting European objectives and for ensuring Scotland continues to have a competitive economy. The Scottish National Reform Programme also highlights that Scotland is on track to meet the education objectives listed in the Europe 2020 paper, the first of which is the aim of reducing the rate of early school leavers from 15% to 10% by 2020. By 2012, we had already reduced this figure to 13%, and I am pleased to note that the number of young people staying in employment, education or training after leaving school is the highest on record, with figures from 2013 showing that 89% of school leavers are still in positive destinations 9 months after leaving school. Further, the percentage of school leavers attaining a qualification at higher level or above has increased, while the rate of those leaving school with no qualifications at SCQF Level 3 fell to a record low of 1.7% in 2011-2012.
Secondly, Scotland is already meeting the European objective of ensuring that at least 40% of 30 to 34-year-olds have a tertiary education by 2020. In 2012, 54% of 30 to 34-year-olds in Scotland already had a level of education up to tertiary level. These figures show that Scotland is progressing well in offering education and training when viewed within a European context. And I look forward to reviewing our Europe 2020 objectives further through our upcoming committee work. I genuinely believe that Scotland can continue to provide the highest standard of education in the British Isles and in Europe. Scrutinising these objectives in our committee work will help to keep Scotland internationally competitive. Now, as members are aware, our committee work programmes are very busy. Yet, despite this, we have managed to successfully incorporate European considerations into our work. I do hope, however, that as the scope of European scrutiny increases, the processes for doing so are improved and streamlined. This will allow us to deal with the issues effectively, but also to make the most efficient use of our limited committee time. Now, some of this time will no doubt be devoted to discussing the newly installed Greek presidency of the Council of Europe, which will, of course, be of particular interest to members. As Greece is a maritime nation, many of the priorities that will be put forward under this presidency will be of interest to Scotland, given our vast territorial waters and economic interests in the North Sea. It is unfortunate that, as one of Europe's premier maritime nations, Scotland does not have many of the powers over portfolios that will undoubtedly be prioritised by the Greek presidency, such as maritime security and coastguard functions. However, in reference to my own committee, there will be a number of issues considered by the Greek presidency that will have particular importance to Scotland. These include European Council recommendations on investing in young people in lifelong learning, recommendations on language learning, and also the discussions on the role of the cultural and creative sector in creating sustainable development. Given these priorities, I welcome the European Committee's move to seek direct representation by inviting the Greek ambassador to give evidence to the committee next month. It is important that Scotland has the ability to engage directly with Europe, to share in best practice and ensure policy is being influenced to reflect Scotland's specific needs. Now, as a member of the European Union's Committee of the Regions, I have seen how beneficial direct Scottish representation can be, and how our absence can lead to decisions being taken on our behalf that are detrimental to our interests. Our committee work should reflect this engagement as much as possible. The Europe 2020 objectives of increasing employment, increasing the amount of energy from renewables and accelerating economic growth while reducing poverty and greenhouse emissions could be achieved more effectively if all the powers that influence them were held here in the Scottish Parliament. Indeed, the recommendations given to the UK recently on the housing market, youth unemployment, support to low-income households and investment in infrastructure would look somewhat different if they were directed to Scotland specifically. This is why I would like to see Scotland at the top table, so that our own demographic make-up and economic conditions are taken into consideration as a unique entity. With our limited powers, it is clear that a gap exists between, between the Scottish Parliament's ability to scrutinise and the Parliament's ability to act on issues that are brought up on a European level. Indeed, where the Scottish Parliament does have power, our policy position is often contrary to policies being pursued by the UK Government. Nonetheless, where we have power to act, we should continue to build on our history of good governance and look to improve on how we engage with the European Union. We are committed to Europe and believe effective collaboration with our European neighbours will create better outcomes for Scotland and a stronger European Union. Finally, it is worth reminding members that this debate takes place within the context of two referendums. One, of course, is the potential of an in-out referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. It goes without saying that this referendum puts Scotland's place under threat and has the potential to diminish our already limited voice on European matters. The second referendum is on whether or not Scotland should be an independent country. This referendum will give us the opportunity to have a full place at the top table, greatly enhancing our voice on the international stage and giving us the chance to make decisions as equals with our European friends and neighbours. And I look forward to that decision being a yes.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be speaking in this debate today on the European and External Relations Committee report on EU engagement and the scrutiny of the committees for the Scottish Parliament on European Union policies 2014. Presiding Officer, in contribution to this debate, I would like to outline my role as one of the EU reporters to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee and how the consideration of the EU policies impacted upon the work of that particular committee. I was appointed as EU reporter by the Local Government and Regeneration Committee in September 2012, and since then have undertaken 2 visits to the EU institutions in Brussels, including a visit in December 2012, in order to build relationships with the Commission and European Parliament, thereby allowing me to investigate the European dimension to forthcoming areas of interest which come within the Committee's remit. This also included bringing the Committee's agreed EU priorities to the attention of COSLA as a key local government stakeholder. And I believe that I have brought EU issues to the attention of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee on 4 occasions since 2012. Mainly, this has been in the context of the ongoing inquiry work of the Committee. In the role as the EU reporter, I believe that the scrutiny of EU issues is central to the remit of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. And this includes the consideration of proposed EU legislation specific to our remit, the EU priorities we identify for each year, as well as the wider mainstreaming of the scrutiny of proposed EU issues arising as part of our committee work programme. And I'm delighted that certainly committee members have taken on board the whole issue of the mainstreaming, and with any inquiry that we undertake, the EU issues that are regularly raised by all committee members. In February 2013, I set out the Local Government and Regeneration Committee's key EU priorities for that year in the EER Committee parliamentary debate on the EU strategy. And they were the EU Multi-Annual Financial Framework and the Scottish Partnership Agreement for 2014-2020, and potential changes in European structural funds, and also the changes to EU public procurement rules. Well, alongside these priorities, over the period from August 2012 to December 2013, the Committee considered the implications of EU legislation or rules in a range of major pieces of work, including the scrutiny of the draft budget 2014-15, inquiry on the implications of procurement reform for public services and community regeneration from the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill, and also in our piece of work regarding the inquiry on the delivery of regeneration in Scotland. The Committee has recently submitted its report to the Finance Committee on the Scottish Government's 2014-15 draft budget. Well, it's obviously now a budget. While the scrutiny of this budget didn't pose any major questions in terms of EU issues for the Committee, we did receive evidence on the role various EU funding mechanisms play in the revenue-generating capacity for Scottish local authorities, and gaining a clearer picture of the role of EU funding across Scottish local government is an issue that the Local Government and Regeneration Committee may wish to return to in terms of its future work programme. Also of concern to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee was the EU's Directive on Public Procurement. Now, local government procurement accounts for nearly 40% of all public procurement in Scotland, which is valued at approximately £9 billion per annum. In tandem with this directive, the Scottish Government introduced the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill, which has obviously gone through the parliamentary process as we speak. Now, the Committee took written and oral evidence on the implications of the directive and the Procurement Reform Scotland Bill in October and November 2013, and as part of this, the Committee examined 3 aspects of policy relevant to its remit, namely that of sustainable procurement, community benefit requirements, and also the transposition of the EU directive into Scots law. The Committee submitted its findings and recommendations to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, which is the lead committee scrutinising the bill. We submitted our findings on the 5th of December 2013. And the findings of the Committee will also inform our 2014 work programme as we prepare for consideration of the forthcoming Community Empowerment Scotland Bill. Another one of the principal EU issues for consideration by the Committee has been the potential changes to EU structural funds as a result of the EU Multi-Annual Financial Framework and the EU's Directive on Public Sector Procurement. In January 2013, the Local Government and Regeneration Committee launched a detailed inquiry into the delivery of the Scottish Government's regeneration strategy, and this inquiry sought to examine the effectiveness of the strategy in developing community-led regeneration across Scotland. Now, that particular piece of work is nearly complete, and anticipate that I will be hopefully signing off the report in the very near future. Now, one of the central issues the Committee considered was the impact of potential changes to EU structural funds and the subsequent implications for regeneration in Scotland. EU structural funding is a key aspect of the regeneration sector in Scotland, both in terms of the Scottish Government funding and in regeneration activity by local government and the third and voluntary sectors. As part of our inquiry, the committee took specific evidence on the role the EU structural funds play in supporting regeneration activity in Scotland and enabling the delivery of various initiatives. And the committee also examined the implication of EU state aid rules in terms of community regeneration. Apart from the main EU priorities for 2013, the committee has also sought to mainstream consideration of EU issues as appropriate in the rest of its work programme, and as I indicated earlier, that certainly colleagues in the committee have undertaken that particular role tremendously well. I stated earlier that the scrutiny of the EU issues is central to the remit of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. We live in an interconnected political environment, which hopefully it might get a little simpler after the 18th of September, when we get direct access to the EU. And I certainly believe that it's only with independence that we can speak with our own voice in the EU, maximising the benefits of membership for the people of Scotland, while contributing to addressing the shared challenges faced by Member States and EU citizens. It's important, however, that all parliamentarians and committees are aware of the impact that EU issues can actually have on their work and also the work of this Parliament. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Ken Macintosh, to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And before the recess, I'm not sure how much interest there was in this debate. The committee's report was broadly welcomed. I would endorse that sentiment today. But that was, of course, before the intervention of President Barroso in the independence debate at the weekend. Now, you'll be relieved to hear, Presiding Officer, and members too probably, that I'm not going to dwell on the subject. But the possibility that we might not even be members of the EU, or certainly not members under the current terms, does cast our discussion on the impact of EU policies in Scotland in a new light. Now, leaving to one side for a moment that fairly fundamental disagreement on our direction of travel as a nation, there is still a great deal on which we can agree today. And I begin by thanking the convener, Christine McKelvey, and a number of members for their kind words about our former colleague, Helen Eadie, and in particular her contribution to the European Committee. And I believe these comments will be warmly welcomed. On a more political, but hopefully similarly consensual note, I hope the convener, the Cabinet Secretary and members across the Chamber would agree that most members and most parties here in the Scottish Parliament are unionists, European unionists, of course. And unlike the policies of George Osborne, for example, most of us are entirely in agreement with the European focus on jobs and growth. Within today's report, for example, the response from the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee highlighted the European Commission's work programme and the concerns expressed about labour market participation amongst young people, older workers and some vulnerable groups. I believe my Labour colleagues and I can make common ground with the Scottish Government in our support for the EU's Youth Guarantee Scheme. Although it has been good to see a fall in overall joblessness in recent months, unemployment amongst young people in Scotland still stands at around 1 in 5, I think a point made by my colleague Willie Coffey slightly earlier, and it remains a hugely worrying issue, not just here but across many European economies. The Youth Guarantee was in fact a Labour initiative, but it's now been approved with a starting budget of €6 billion, giving young people a guarantee of work, education or training. Unfortunately, the Tory government doesn't seem to share our sense of priority. From what I can gather, they've yet to submit an implementation plan for the Youth Employment Guarantee, leaving us in danger of missing the boat, and I certainly hope we can see progress on this issue in 2014. I also found myself entirely in agreement with the EET Committee's observations on securing more help for small to medium-sized enterprises. Access to finance, access to procurement opportunities and access to European funds are all issues of real importance for Scottish SMEs and mark an area where I hope we'll be able to also make progress this year. SMEs are in fact crucial to our success in tackling unemployment. They account for 99% of all private sector businesses in the UK, 60% of private sector employment. SMEs are more likely to employ people with low or no qualifications or skills, and the young and unemployed are more likely to find their way back into employment with small employers. On the other hand, most SMEs lack human resource departments and are often relatively sceptical of national recruitment schemes. So there are obstacles to overcome, but both for jobs and growth, these are areas where we need to work closely with our European partners. I believe there are other lessons too we can learn from Europe. I've mentioned before, I think, what's our shared admiration for the German Mittelstand, for their work-sharing agreements and their work-time accounts, their Kurzarbeit. In many ways, what underpins the success of their approach is a different set of economic values, a more ethical way of approaching our economy, by, for example, placing an emphasis on loyalty to local communities, on long-term thinking and on worker representation on the boards of companies. Now, I know that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance is looking in this direction, and he has our support in some of the work on the National Performance Framework. But there are mixed messages coming across too. Where, for example, my colleagues in Europe have been voting in favour of the financial transaction tax, I note that SNP MEPs have refused to support calls for measures to combat tax evasion, tax avoidance and tax fraud. In fact, they ended up on the same side of the debate as the Tories and UKIP and voted against ending bilateral tax agreements. Now, one of the biggest political strengths in being part of Europe is the opportunity to advance social rights, not just establish free markets. And if we fail to take advantage of that common agenda, we are missing out every bit as much as failing to bid for competitive funding. There are two other areas I'd briefly like to touch on. I noted the Education Committee, and I welcome Stuart Maxwell's comments earlier. I noted the Education Committee used the report to flag up the importance of language learning. Again, I would welcome and endorse that call, but my own recent parliamentary questions revealed a staggering drop in the number of Scottish pupils being put forward for German exams, from almost 16,000 in 2002-03 to around 6,000 in 2012-13. And on top of that dramatic reduction, the move to the curriculum for excellence, and in particular the fact that most schools seem to be offering fewer of the new exams, has now been reported as having a particularly disproportionate effect on the numbers coming forward to sit a modern language exam. The Scottish Government has made a number of commitments to modern language learning, but I worry that the real picture reveals us to be going backwards. I look forward to any help that the Education or European committees can provide to reverse that trend. Now, finally, I am very pleased too that the EER Committee is taking an active interest in EU measures to reduce human trafficking. It was an issue brought up by the convener, Mr Coffey, Ms Ferguson and a number of others. I would draw the Minister's attention likewise to the Members' Bill on human trafficking, now submitted by my colleague Jenny Mara, which lays out a number of measures which would help tackle this issue in Scotland and which are entirely within the devolved settlement. It is estimated, for example, that there are more victims of traffickers in our prisons in Scotland than there are human traffickers themselves. This bill would create a new offence of aiding, abetting or attempting to commit human trafficking and would help prevent the victims going to jail, all in the context of a 3-year strategy to be published and agreed by Parliament. Presiding Officer, I suspect members will continue to disagree on our constitutional future within Europe, but I hope we will also recognise our shared agenda and that all of us in Scotland are better together, making common cause with the European Union.
Thank you. And finally, before the closing speeches, I call Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And firstly, may I apologise to the opening speakers for not being here. Lack of communication, which was directly down to me. I welcome the Scottish Government's action plan on European engagement and looking ahead at issues of importance to Scotland for the forthcoming EU presidency after Mr Barroso is gone. As has been mentioned, there are defined action plans that are embraced by the programme, particularly in areas of energy and climate change, marine environment, research and development, and of course security and justice. So I'm delighted to participate in this debate, as I was delighted to be part of the delegation, along with the convener and representatives of the other committees, to discuss public procurement directives in September last year. I seemed at that time to remember a fair amount of talking, but even a lot more walking. I was questioning whether there were taxis, in fact, in Brussels at that time. The profitable ventures, one was to discuss the Government's procurement reform bill and attendant European directives. And it's striking that, having heard from Jamie McGregor the fabulistic divergences that might occur when Scotland becomes independent, that one of the features of that visit was the determination, the information that Westminster wanted to accelerate, to bring forward their directives that attach to the Westminster procurement laws. I wonder why. In addition to that area of mutual interest was a visit I made at the same time to the Economy as the economy rapporteur on that day to the Commission for Enterprise to discuss Europe's new programme for funding, particularly for SMEs, as has been referred to in the Chamber. And in that context, Presiding Officer, and as an extension of information received in a previous meeting in Brussels, was that Scotland was somewhat divorced from the European Commission SME activity and funding because simply we were not a member state. And as a consequence of that, we were not being told by our current member state as to exactly what was going on. For example, there is a programme for a small business envoy to represent small businesses across Europe in each of the member states. There was a range of pre-directive meetings that the Commission would hold with small businesses in each of the member states. Again, we were not told. And we only had a few accredited financial enterprise organisations who could interface with the funds, which I will mention in a minute. We had 4 of these organisations. The UK had 76. These matters were subsequently raised with the Scottish Government and personally by me with various representative SME bodies. General acceptance was that the Commission clearly saw that SMEs are key players in working with the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund as a key player in growth of employment and innovation across Europe. The report called for a huge culture shift. The ERC report called for a huge culture shift being required across public and corporate sectors. And this was recognised also as an integral part of the Economy Committee's Access to Finance inquiry, which was carried out last November and December, out of which flowed recommendations on the cost and administrative burdens faced by SMEs. I'm delighted that, as a consequence, and after, I have to say, some provocation, a meeting was established by Scotland Europa and was held last Thursday in Edinburgh to explain the financial instruments in EU funding programmes for the period 2014 to 2020. Now, if I may, Presiding Officer, I'd like to leave aside the Horizon 2020 €70 billion fund, a fund designed to leverage private sector investment in research and development and, indeed, in innovation. And rather, I'd like to focus on what was known as the COSME programme, the programme that develops the competitiveness of enterprises and SMEs over the period 2014 to 2020. €2.3 billion, of which €1.4 billion have been designated for financial instruments. We all know the difficulty that SMEs have in accessing finance, be it needed for growth, for efficiency, for energy low-carbon programmes, or indeed allowing them to be able to export outside national markets. These funds, in tandem with other local investment facilities, should increase annual lending and investment for EU companies, for SME companies in the EU, by €3.5 billion over that period. The 2 financial instruments, the Equity Facility for Growth, which will provide venture capital, and mezzanine finance for expansion and growth stage enterprise, is, of course, a key element of that funding, as is the Loan Guarantee Facility, which will provide counter-guarantees, direct guarantees and other risk-sharing arrangements, covering loans up to €150,000, and that available to all SMEs. The funding, no doubt, will certainly help SMEs, and SMEs in Scotland when we sit at the top table. There is a need to develop, of course, accredited bodies that will interface with the EIF and the small businesses to ensure that we capitalise on these programmes. Presiding Officer, I've been on a fairly long political journey, and I arrived happily at the destination which I am now at. I ran 8 companies across Europe, 550 people, $75 million of revenue, and clearly, from that experience, recognise why we have to achieve what we will achieve on September the 18th. If some of the countries I sat on the boards of can do what they're doing, then we can as well. So we have to build on these exercises, on these funds, and engage Scotland Europa particularly to encourage them to evangelise across local authorities, small business enterprises, to ensure that our SMEs going forward are highly successful, encourage employment and encourage revenues for our independent country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the closing speeches, and I call on Cameron Buchanan with up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to be able to contribute to this debate on the engagement and scrutiny of the committees of Parliament on EU policies, and agree those who have already praised the European and External Relations Committee work in this area. Many, including the Cabinet Secretary, have already commented on the importance of engagement with the EU policy agenda, and it hardly needs re-emphasising. But given the impact EU legislation and regulation has on so many policy areas, proactive dialogue is absolutely critical. However, so many of the contributions this afternoon have led me to reflect on the engagement process. And I see this as being very much open-ended, multi-faced conversation taking in all interested partners. With regards to the Parliament, I think it is important that we acknowledge the progress made by the European Committee on mainstreaming the scrutiny of various EU initiatives. Given the scope of legislation, we must be mindful of EU legislation in all areas and in all aspects of our ongoing work, but we should not allow complacency. Firstly, scrutiny of EU policy directives and proactive engagement is only worthwhile so long as the Commission proves that it is responsive to the views expressed. Accordingly, I would suggest the inclusion of a European Public Prosecutor's Office in its work programme should be of concern to us all. Despite the fact that it has triggered the yellow card procedure, as we've heard, and that it has been rejected in its present form by so many parliaments and forums, the Commission has indicated that it intends to maintain the proposal, largely untouched. A number of parliaments agreed with the point raised by our Justice Committee that it did not comply with the principle of subsidiarity, the importance of which is reiterated in the Scottish Government's EU Reform Priorities document. The UK Government put forward the sensible view that the Commission would have been far better to focus on better cooperation between national governments rather than introducing new legislation. I'm afraid the whole scrutiny process is rendered useless if the Commission proves so obdurate in the face of such criticism. Moreover, when we consider that some areas where arguably there is a greater sign of progress within the EU, it shows the necessity for a very broad view of engagement. This afternoon, we have already heard on the continued commitment to growth and promoting employment as the central theme of the Commission's work. And within that, contributions have referred to the laudable aims and goals of the Horizon 2020 programme. However, it is important to bear in mind that this is a strategy that is very much being driven forward by national governments, and indeed many commentators have speculated this is one of the key reasons behind its success. A point which perhaps the Scottish Government should bear in mind when complaining of the limitations of the present system. To me, this demonstrates that our engagement on our EU priorities should not merely be reserved for a two-way dialogue with Brussels, and this highlights the importance of our relationship with the UK Government and the potential of what can be achieved when national governments take the lead. I also believe we are central to engagement with the European Commission, and it is our individual responsibility as MSPs to consider the impact of EU regulation in all areas of our work, something that has been highlighted as well. We should not content ourselves with our committee work or limit our deliberations to these areas set out by the Scottish Government in its priorities document. Indeed, the fact that the Commission's work programme remains focused on economic and monetary union, particularly a banking union, raises concerns. Now, there is a good deal of work in this area which is welcome. However, the single resolution mechanism and the introduction of financial transaction tax is a real concern, particularly for the threat it poses to our banks, given that there is a high likelihood that transactions would simply be shifted abroad to countries where no such tax applies. Accordingly, the need for it to be a globally imposed tax, and in this I note the robust stance of the UK Government in protecting our banks and financial institutions, which is so important, particularly here in Edinburgh and the Lothians. Given the implications that these changes would have, I do find it slightly surprising that there is no mention of this in the Government's priorities. Indeed, I would have thought they would support the UK Government's strong line in opting out of these potentially damaging measures and highlighting the fact, given the financial transaction tax implications for economic growth in Scotland. Of course, Presiding Officer, the banking union is a direct response to the EU banking crisis, which dramatically exposed the inherent flaws in having a currency union without a political one. Despite the fact we know the Scottish Government are seriously arguing for the establishment of a currency union between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK, whilst abandoning our long-standing and successful political union, it is a deeply flawed argument. And I cannot help agree with my colleague Jamie McGrigor that the Government's Scottish priorities document is so heavy on rhetoric and bluster that in order to distract from the gaping holes at the centre of its plan on currency and the succession of an independent Scotland to the EU. Certainly.
I hear what you say about gaping holes. I wonder if you can try and help us with the gaping hole that might turn up when the UK decides to leave Europe.
Cameron Buchanan.
I don't think that's yet a possibility, and I don't know that we should consider that. Anyway, yes, I will. Thank you. I've just about come to the end. I was agreeing with my colleague Jamie McGrigor that the Government Scotland's priorities document is heavy on rhetoric and bluster in order to distract from the gaping holes at the centre of its plan on currency and the succession of an independent Scotland to the EU. So, Presiding Officer, I welcome the motion today, whilst reminding all interested parties that whereas the EU is concerned, there is no room for complacency, and we must ensure engagement with all concerned. Thank you.
Many thanks. And I now call on Patricia Ferguson. 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, can I begin my closing remarks by thanking very much the convener of the European Committee and the members, as well as the clerks and our colleagues from SPICE who attend the meeting, for their warm welcome to me as a substitute originally for my colleague Helen Eadie, and then as a full member with effect from the beginning of this year. As I think colleagues probably know, this is likely to be my last week in the committee as a member, and I have very much enjoyed being back on the committee, which I was a member of in a previous session of the Parliament, and of being part of their very important scrutiny of the elements of the White Paper that relate to the committee's work. We haven't always agreed. I think it would have been impossible for us to have agreed, no matter how hard we tried. But I think we have done our job in terms of scrutinising those who came before us to give evidence, and that really is what should be expected of us. While I'm doing my thanks, my sort of Oscar award ceremony, part of my speech, and I promise I won't burst into tears or go on forever, but I do have one other person I would wish to thank. Members would have heard Stuart Maxwell mention earlier that he's a member of the Committee of the Regions, as am I. And I would like to thank Stuart Maxwell, Presiding Officer, as a slightly old stager in regard to the Committee of the Regions. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that. Only in regard to the Committee of the Regions, Mr Maxwell. Very much for the informal induction to that organisation which he provided to me a year ago when I became a member. It was very, very helpful to me because, as we know, the institutions and the mechanics of all the bodies of the EU can be labyrinthine. And it was very helpful of Mr Maxwell to guide me through as a new member at that time. I'm not sure he likes the direction of travel his protégé has now taken, but that's perhaps another issue for another day. But one of the things that has become very clear to me during my membership of the Committee of the Regions is just how important other countries take the work of Europe and the high regard in which it is held by many of them. Now, that's not to say that every action undertaken by the Union or the Commissions is met with unalloyed support across Europe. But I think it's fair to say that European issues are perhaps much better embedded in the political life of some other countries than perhaps they always are here. And a debate like this and the work that the European Committee and our committees are doing, I think helps very much to strengthen our work in Europe and helps to strengthen our position. And in that regard, I would just say, gently, if I may, to colleagues on the benches opposite, that frankly, other colleagues throughout Europe find the position of the current UK government regarding Europe absolutely incomprehensible. And they just don't understand what it is that the UK Government hopes to get out of its current sabre-rattling about renegotiation. Now, I realise that there are differing views even within the Conservative Party on that particular issue, and I really don't want to rub salt in their wounds, but it makes it very difficult when one goes to Europe to try and argue a position to always be then asked, yes, but what is the UK Government thinking on that particular issue? So I'll leave that one with them to perhaps think about. I think, Presiding Officer, this has been an excellent debate, and I think many of our colleagues have brought from their own subject committees a great deal of knowledge and expertise, and it has been really interesting to hear just how much the issues concerning Europe have become part of the everyday work of the committee. And I think that was the original intention of the European Committee, and I'm very pleased to see it come to that particular position. On the issue of climate change, I thought Claudia Beamish's intervention earlier on was absolutely right, because we can set as many targets as we like, but unless we seriously work to reach those targets and seriously monitor our progress along the way, frankly, those targets are as of naught. We must be rigorous in that regard, and we must make sure that if we can't reach our targets, that we're honest about it and we think about the reasons why that is the case. But I'll leave that one there. An interesting area, I thought, of crossover from the reports that we received from the committees was on the agendas of the Environment and Rural Affairs Committee and the Economy and Energy and Tourism Committee, both of whom have a concern about the provision of funding for training within the renewables sector. I thought that was actually a very interesting point that was made, that actually this is something that more than one committee of the Parliament might be interested in. And I think that probably is a theme that will develop as this work of mainstreaming the European issues comes through. I know that the committees are pursuing the issue of that funding with Scottish Development, Skills Development Scotland, rather, and it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. I was also intrigued by the fact, or pleased, I suppose, by the fact that many of our subject committees now seem to be engaging directly with EU commissioners. I think that's a really good point. And they don't any longer consider it to be the exclusive interest of the European Committee. And I think the Environment Committee has done some good work on that, and I seriously hope that other committees will do that too when there are particular issues that they want to discuss and raise. Obviously, there's been a great deal of work being done across the Parliament about procurement, and it will be interesting to see how that comes out when we come to debate later on the issue of the procurement bill. But I thought that the work of the Economy Committee on the issue of underemployment was very important, because we often forget that within the statistics there are different breakdowns and different definitions. And underemployment, the issues of zero-hours contracts, particularly in relation to the employment of women, I think are important issues to bring to the fore, as are youth employment and job creation, which the Education Committee flagged up. Modern language teaching, I think, is one where the European Committee has actually done some very, very good work. I wasn't on the committee at the time, so I'm not claiming any credit for that. But I think they have done some very useful work, and I hope it is an area that the Education Committee will take forward. And similarly, in the Equal Opportunities Committee, the work that they are doing regarding gypsy travellers has, of course, resonance with the work that's being done across Europe on the issue of the Roma and gypsy travellers. So it's clear to me that there are read across. There is read across, that's better. There is read across in Europe about some of these issues that are of such importance to us. We've heard about human trafficking. I mentioned that myself in the opening, and I do hope that the Government will commit to backing Jenny Mara's bill that's introduced today and has cross-party, all-party support, I think it is. Now, female genital mutilation was also raised by the Equal Opportunities Committee, and we had a very good debate, again led by Jenny Mara, a week or two back. And it's clear to me that this is an issue which isn't just Europe-wide, but is actually worldwide, and one that we have to give serious consideration to. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the debate that the Justice Committee will lead in May about the UK opt-out. I think that's an issue that this Parliament really needs to take very seriously indeed and needs to monitor with a great deal of thoroughness. I'm sure the Justice Committee will do that, but I think it's actually an issue that goes beyond even the Justice Committee and those who have a particular interest in issues around the justice agenda, and I think it will be one that will be interesting to all of us, or should at least be of interest to all of us. My colleague Ken McIntosh was quite right to mention the importance of SMEs and the difficulties that they have. SMEs are much more likely to employ individual people or one or two people here and there, and that can often be the difference that has to be made. I had actually a little formula here that I'd worked out for Willie Coffey in answer to his question. I'm being told that I have to wind up. So I'll perhaps share that with Mr Coffey at the meeting of the European Committee on Thursday. But I think in closing, Presiding Officer, I would just want to say that I think the work that is now being done by the committees around this Parliament in relation to the European agenda is extremely good. I think there's always more that we can do, and I would like to see it become even more embedded than it currently is. But I think actually the work that is being done is going in the right direction, and I hope it continues in that direction.
Many thanks. And I now call on Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary, up to 10 minutes.
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate the Chamber on what I think has been an insightful debate marked by informed speeches, and I'd also like to thank the Europe and External Relations Committee for their annual report on each of the committee's EU priorities. It has provided the base for positive discussions and indeed accountability of the Government to the Parliament, which I hope will continue over the course of the year. And the debate has really highlighted to me the importance of the contribution of the EU to modern life in Scotland, as well as the significant contribution that Scotland has made to the EU. I was very struck by the remark that the convener, Christina McKelvey, said when she said all committees are European committees now. And I think in the contribution by Stuart Maxwell, the extensive identification of the Education Committee's contribution, it struck me how different it perhaps was from when I was a member of the Education Committee along with Ken McIntosh. And perhaps the extensiveness of the European debate is more evident now. Patricia Ferguson quite rightly talked about the importance of early engagement and mainstreaming, and she also identified the importance of transposition of EU law. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to all those who are involved in it. It's a very extensive piece of work, transposing EU law into Scots law, and in the committee's role in doing that as well. David Stewart talked about rural funding, always a challenge, and he also recognised the success that we've managed to achieve collectively in addressing some of the structural funds issues that we faced earlier in this year. And I'm sure if he writes the relevant Cabinet Secretary in relation to the court cases he's referred to, he can get a response. Willie Coffey identified the issue of IT infrastructure. Indeed, in our publication of priorities for EU reform, we have identified IT as one of the areas that we want to focus on. He and indeed others, Patricia Ferguson and Ken McIntosh, referred to modern slavery and trafficking. We are paying close attention to the UK bill on modern slavery. There are issues around the constitutional settlement as to what we can do here, but obviously victims of trafficking are very much part of our society, and we have to make sure that we respond adequately. But I also would like to highlight that in our paper on the EU priorities, we've also identified the importance of Member States working collectively on this area. And in that regard, I'd like to place on record thanks to the committee convener, Christina McKelvey, for her extensive work on the international aspects of human trafficking and bringing that agenda very much to this Parliament. Rod Campbell, I think, made a very interesting and very informed contribution about some of the legal aspects in relation to the freedom and the justice agenda and the real concerns we have about the UK's agenda on the opt-outs. And I think Patricia Ferguson is quite right that it's not just a committee issue that I'm sure, as it has in the past, be an issue that returns not only to the Justice Committee, the European Committee, but also to the floor of this chamber. It's very extensive indeed, and we have to address it. But it wouldn't be possible to review the priorities of the Scottish Parliament in the European Union without also reviewing the manner in which these priorities are taken up by the UK Government as Scotland's representative to the EU institutions. And I think that should be the biggest concern for this Parliament. The UK Prime Minister has gone on record to say he is seeking a complete renegotiation of the EU treaties so that the power, and I quote, flows back to the Member States, who will go forward combining it in flexible cooperation. The UK Prime Minister is seeking a return to the days when the Member States act unilaterally in their own interests, cooperating flexibly only where these interests align with others, taking back the powers that the Member States have conferred on the EU institutions. That signals a retreat from collective action in Brussels to unilateral action from London. And I share Patricia Ferguson's assessment about how this is being seen across our European friends and neighbours. However, I don't think it is the EU treaties which are in need of renegotiation. I think it's the constitutional settlement in the UK which has failed to keep in step with the process of European integration. And the base of power in many areas now rests in Brussels with the EU institutions rather than in London with the UK government. Indeed, in last year's debate, it was pointed out that roughly 2/3 of UK legislation now originates from Brussels. And despite our best efforts to work constructively with the UK government and the EU institutions to contribute to the reform of EU law and policy, the report that I have published today, entitled Scotland's Priorities for EU Reform, demonstrates how the current constitutional settlement in the UK prevents Scotland from exerting real and direct influence of those policies and laws that this Parliament has so keenly debated today. Scotland, its government and its parliament do not have a direct voice in the European Union. And in setting out our reform agenda, we have, from the Scottish Government's perspective, covered semesters 2 and 3 that have already been submitted by the Scottish Government to the UK. The UK only last week published its response, particularly in relation to semester 2. So it's very timely indeed that we debate and are aware of these issues as we consider what the Scottish Parliament views as the EU priorities for this country. Now is the time for this nation to consider how Scotland can best be represented in the seat of power and how this Parliament and its government can best influence European laws and policies in accordance with Scotland's priorities. And none of the other Member States want to remove this choice from the people of Scotland. The German Government have said that the Scots will decide on their independence in a referendum on the 18th of September 2014. The Federal Government will respect the result and does not prejudge it. The Slovenian Government have said that Slovenia recognises the universal right of peoples to self-determination expressed through a democratic process, and we believe that it is an internal political matter of every individual state. The Polish Government, the question of the Scottish independence is a matter to be decided within the United Kingdom. Poland will respect the outcome of any arrangement that would be applied. The French Government, this is a domestic political issue for the UK. We cannot possibly comment. And indeed,
I welcome the comments from the Cabinet Secretary. Can I ask her, what did she make of the First Minister's spokesperson, who yesterday said that if other EU countries such as Spain didn't accept Scotland's membership under independence, they would blockade them from the North Sea?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say, I think it's really important that we understand the real arguments of democracy.
Order, please, Mr Brodie, Mr Mackintosh.
The arguments here about the democracy and the right of the people of Scotland to make their own decision, and what I'm listing here are a number of quotes from other European governments that recognise that. So the Lithuanian government have said that Lithuania will respect the will of the Scottish people to be expressed at the 2014 referendum held in line with the Edinburgh Agreement. And the government of the Czech Republic have said that the Czech Republic will respect the will expressed by the Scottish people in the referendum on Scotland's independence that is to be held in the latter half of 2014. Now, all these members are absolutely right. The referendum on independence is a matter for the people of Scotland, and other countries recognise it's for the Scottish people to decide their own future. And on September the 18th, the future of Scotland will lie in their hands, and in their hands alone. But in the note of consensus that Ken Mackintosh has asked for and his appeal for a shared agenda, when we make that decision, we will do so as a nation well engaged with the European democratic ideal, a Parliament well engaged with European priorities and with an opportunity to contribute constructively with reform of the EU law and policy from an informed and engaged position, having comprehensively assessed European competencies, policies and priorities. And I'm closing at this moment, and I thank the committee for their contribution in achieving that position, which ensures that Scotland as a whole is well engaged in European priorities, that we account for them in this Parliament, we're engaged with them, and not only that, we look outwards and contribute to a very positive policy agenda within the European Union.
Thank you. I now call on Christina McKelvey to wind up the debate on behalf of the European and External Relations Committee. Ms McKelvey, you have until 4:49.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Having opened the debate this afternoon and now...
Sorry, apologies, 4:59.
I was wondering. Okay. I thought, okay. I'm in the very fortunate position to be now closing the debate, which is quite unusual for a committee, but our friend and colleague Hans Al Malik couldn't make it here today, so we sent him our best wishes and hope that we are working together very, very closely over the next year. But today's debate, I think, has been very, very interesting, and it is helpful to hear MSPs highlight their own personal areas of interest along with their committees' European priorities for the coming year. And as has been said, we are going through a change this year with the European elections in May and the appointment of a new College of Commissioners over the summer, and not forgetting we have the referendum in September, and I believe over the summer the swearing in of new MEPs as well. So it is important that we consider the European dimension at all times, and at all times try to mainstream these issues into part of our day-to-day work. And can I thank all members for their contributions over the past year on the committee, and for the contributions of all members in the debate today. And I echo comments made by some of the members of the committee regarding the importance of EU funding and support to ensure Scotland can pursue its own domestic policies. The Scottish Government's digital agenda and the rollout of broadband across all parts of Scotland relies on these funds, and this committee and the ICI committee will continue to monitor developments in this area to ensure that there is no detrimental impact on the rollout of broadband across all areas of Scotland, and I'll touch on that a wee bit more later. I also want to reiterate the point made regarding Scotland's farmers, crofters and fishermen, and how it is imperative that this Parliament continues to scrutinise the implications of recent agricultural and fisheries policy reform and the support that they receive. Presiding Officer, I think you'll agree that there's a very, very diverse issues raised today across this chamber, and it is a testament to the work that the committees in this Parliament are doing with issues from the EU that impact on Scotland. And just a flavour of them, running through sort of in chronological order almost, is we've had early engagement in mainstreaming, the CAP budget, the CFP budget, digital infrastructure, youth employment, structural EU funding and all types of EU funding, justice and home affairs, education and culture, public procurement, youth employment, employment for small and medium enterprises, support for small and medium enterprises, climate change, funding for training in the renewable sector, trafficking and FGM issues, and notwithstanding the in-out referendum, direct access to the EU Council meeting and Scotland's place in Europe. Very diverse indeed. So I'm going to sum up on some of those to try and just pick out a number of the things that we went along. And the Cabinet Secretary in her opening remarks addressed very clearly some of the very political questions that we've had today. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that because we already have, and we have our own ongoing inquiry in the committee looking at the proposals of Scotland's place in Europe and how we want to take that forward. And certainly the committee is continuing to take evidence and would take any evidence from any quarter who has got something to add to the debate. One of the key aspects that the committee has been looking at, and it seems to have a clear impact on committees across the chamber, is how structural funds and any opportunity for funding that we can get from Europe. And I see my colleague Dave Stewart nodding his head there. He will know, along with Linda Stewart, that we have worked very, very hard on the committee to ensure that we look at every aspect of European funding, structural funding, or any type of funding that we can maybe get our fingers on and use to actually boost our economic output in Scotland, create opportunities for our young people, develop and boost the economic growth of our rural sector and our cities as well. One clear aspect of that leads on is how we fund youth employment, the 52 million euros that has been mentioned, along with, I think there's £50 million in total from the Scottish Government, I think with 10 million of that coming from EU funding, which will help 10,000 additional young people getting access to real opportunities to raise their skill levels. And the general impact that will then have on unemployment figures. We heard the very distressing unemployment figures from Spain, and how we are working on that, and hopefully maybe creating some examples where our friends in Spain could maybe follow some of the good success that we have had. We have also heard about the disappointment, and it's something this committee always looks at, of Scottish ministers still finding it difficult to get their voices heard speaking at council meetings. I think we have 1 or 2 ministers that seem to be very successful in doing that, and I think that's a testament to the fact that they've become an expert in that field. Richard Lochhead being one of them, and many other ministers, but still not getting that voice heard is very, very important to this committee indeed. And touching on some of the specifics, Patricia Ferguson, and I would like to at this point say to Patricia that we were glad she came on the committee, because she has got such a wealth of knowledge, and her participation in the Committee of the Regions has always been helpful to know from that point of view what's going on. To then lose you again, Patricia, is a loss to the committee, and we wish you all the best and where you go with that. And I think you'll find that in many cases we don't agree on the committee, but in many cases that we do, and the areas that we do agree on, we work very, very hard to take those forward, and you will be missed from the committee, Patricia. Ms Ferguson, sorry. Patricia Ferguson did raise the issue about the inquiry and how the inquiry has been ongoing. This is the inquiry that we currently have, which we hope will report in early, maybe summer, late spring. And it's an inquiry in the Scottish Government's proposals for Scotland's place in Europe. And as I said before, we've taken very detailed and interesting evidence, and the committee remains open to any other information that people think that we can use to inform that inquiry on going forward, and how we use that. As I say, it is an ongoing inquiry. Jamie McGregor had mentioned it as well. And turning to Jamie, Jamie said that he would look forward to crossing swords. But I think, Jamie, it's testament and actually an honour in this chamber that the only weapons that we actually use in Scotland in our fight for whatever we believe in is words and not swords. And I don't own a sword, Jamie, so I think you'll just need to put up with me using my words as weapons. I'm sorry, Mr McGregor's getting a wee bit anxious there, but I was just making a bit of fun of the fact
Mr McGregor's making
swords,
interventions from a sedentary position.
Yes, that's okay. But certainly I'm continuing to look forward. Jamie McGregor actually raised a very, very important part of the committee's work, and it's ongoing scrutiny, and it's how we look at, how do we drill down, how do we get to the point where we understand, what a European directive means, or what a change in policy means, and the impact that has, and that's something that Jamie McGregor is very, very good at. As is my colleague Willie Coffey, always on the ball with the digital agenda, concerns about the speed of progress, the building of IT infrastructure. There is not a point where Mr Coffey has not, with forensic focus, scrutinised the position around about IT infrastructure and how we can make that much better in Scotland, not just, as Patricia Ferguson said earlier, in rural areas, but also in our cities. He raised the anti-trafficking coordinator, which was a great honour to have her come to the committee, and the challenges that we have. It certainly opened our eyes and our ears to the challenges and the progress in dealing with that abhorrent practice. Dave Stewart again on structural funds. I don't think we disagree in anything there, and certainly on Highlands and Islands. He extended a visit to the committee to come up and see Keswick Bridge and Mallaig Road. Having travelled the Mallaig Road in a very romantic journey once, Mr Stewart, I think I'll be delighted to bring the committee, and we will certainly discuss that at a future committee meeting and how we would maybe satisfy that invitation. Rod Campbell again. Certainly.
I was very happy to extend an invite to Mallaig Road, but I didn't realise the romantic aspect was extended as well.
I did say it was a formal romantic journey, but I look forward to maybe reliving some of that in my own head. Rod Campbell covered Justice and Home Affairs and very, very important issues, the House of Lords EU Select Committee and the recommendations that they gave to the UK Government, which they have now decided to ignore and go ahead with the recommendations on opting out of some of the very important aspects of Justice and Home Affairs around about the EU Arrest Warrant and the EU Public Prosecutor's Office. Again, this committee and the Justice Committee will keep that on its radar. Stuart Maxwell talked about how we educate our young people, specifically the committee's inquiry into foreign languages and how that's worked extremely well in raising the profile and engaging more people. He's talked about the qualification levels and how we're already beating the EU targets. Again, it just shows you how the committees cross over in that. He talked about the gap in representation. Stuart McMillan talked about public procurement, something that is very important to this committee, and I did raise it in my opening remarks. But Ken McIntosh did scare me by suggesting that I was a unionist. And to clarify, I am actually a European internationalist. I will never be called a unionist. But he did raise some very serious issues that the UK Government have yet to ratify the Youth Guarantee Scheme, and I look forward to working with my colleagues across the Chamber, ensuring that that happens. Chick Brodie reminded us about SMEs and the economic impact of SMEs. Horizon 2020, the COSME programme, gave us in-depth information on the potential of financial instruments and how we should evangelise on all of these. In closing the debate today, Presiding Officer, I hope that others have found the report interesting, certainly not boring, and I look forward to meeting the Greek ambassador, as Jamie McGregor has talked about. He's coming in early spring to talk about the incoming Greek presidency and its priorities for the forthcoming 6 months. We have a reception on the 5th of March and the ambassador on the 6th of March, and I think you'll agree, just hearing from across the Chamber, a very diverse and interesting group of activity going on, but certainly something that we hope to take forward and maintain that interest for the next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes the European and External Relations Committee debate on its report on EU engagement and scrutiny of the committees of the Scottish Parliament on European Union policies. We now move to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 9066 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to the business programme for Wednesday, 19th of February 2014. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9066.
Formally moved, Presiding Officer.
No member has asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 9066, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. There are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 8974, in the name of John Lamont, on the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to, and the City of Edinburgh Council Leith Links and Surplus Fire Fund Bill is passed. The next question is that motion number 9001, in the name of Christina McKelvey, on the report on EU engagement and scrutiny of the committees of the Scottish Parliament on European Union policies be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.